The desert is still. The night seems endless, silent, and at peace, until it's pierced by the sound of gunshots and screams. Deep in the Sahara, the SCP Foundation is waging war against a newly discovered enemy. A squad of Foundation agents is retreating, trying to get away from the ones who massacred their allies. They were attempting to eliminate the threat using conventional means, but their rifles were no match for the reality-bending entities of the Kingdom of Abaddon. The retreating agents cover one another as they make their way back to the extraction point. The enemy force advances. Agents that are caught too close to the sorcerers of Abaddon disintegrate into thin air. This is not an enemy they can defeat. The SCP agents need to get back to base and relay what they have found to their superiors. Out of the hundreds of agents sent into the Sahara that night, only a handful make it out alive. They are debriefed by their superiors at the Foundation, who classified the anomalous humanoids under the highest of threat levels. The Kingdom of Abaddon is a threat. The Kingdom of Abaddon must be eliminated. Reconnaissance done prior to the disastrous mission had alerted the Foundation to the presence of anomalies in the region, but they had no idea how strong the anomalous humanoids would be. From data gathered through old reports, it seemed like the Abaddon humanoids were responsible for the deaths of no fewer than 75 Foundation personnel, and had stolen at least 12 different items from the Foundation. The leaders of the SCP Foundation tasked Research Team Omega-5 with developing a weapon that would be capable of destroying the Kingdom of Abaddon once and for all. The weapon they are researching must be capable of long-range destruction, because the moment any Foundation agent gets close to the area, they are vaporized by the reality-manipulating powers of its inhabitants. The project is given the name Twins of God, and is led by a Foundation doctor known only by the designation 051. 051 is popular in the SCP Foundation, well known for his in-depth research and charismatic personality, making him the perfect person to lead such a project. And 051 recently came across an anomaly that he believes holds the solution the Foundation has been looking for to defeat the Kingdom of Abaddon, Item 001. And so the Omega-5 team gets to work. They discover that the anomaly has incredible powers when put inside a host, which they refer to as an Item 001 entity, and set up a series of experiments using different people to harness its energy. The first series of tests all end in tragedy. The anomaly causes the entity it inhabits to become intensely radioactive. Anyone who gets close to it succumbs to immediate radiation sickness, and eventually, death. To stop the radiation problems, the Omega-5 research group intensifies the containment procedures. 051 receives reports from the higher-ups that the Kingdom of Abaddon has attacked another Foundation facility in Sudan. Long-range defense is needed ASAP. The administrator puts more pressure on Omega-5, and especially its leader 051, to solve the problems of Item 001 and develop a weapon that can save the Foundation. He stays awake for days on end, working tirelessly to create a safe and controllable Item 001 entity. Although there are signs that the weapon will work, it is still unpredictable. When Item 001 is initiated, the host entity becomes paralyzed, suffers severe cerebral hemorrhaging, and soon a new host is needed before testing can begin again. And that's not the only thing that goes wrong. Whenever the anomaly is put into a new host, sudden and random destruction of on-site structures and personnel take place. 051 knows, though, that if this power can be harnessed and controlled in the right way, that it could be the weapon that the Foundation needs to wipe out the Kingdom of Abaddon once and for all. In order to control Item 001, 051 has a mind kill switch implanted in its host's brains. 051 can activate the implant to incapacitate its host and immediately stop the unwanted destruction. Countless hosts are terminated by this mind kill switch in the early trials conducted by the Omega-5 team, but progress continues to be made, and eventually a hypothesis is formulated. Perhaps the disastrous side effects of Item 001 can be offset by spreading the anomaly across multiple subjects. They theorize that the immense mental load of the anomaly can be distributed among several hosts, thus reducing the toil it takes on each and giving them the ability to control its immense power. But 051 and the Omega-5 team need more data, and for that, they need more bodies. They consult with the director of Site-17, and it is concluded that the nearby town of San Marco would be an appropriate place to get the additional test subjects they require. On a quiet Sunday morning, Omega-5, along with support from a squad of armed SCP agents, storm into the San Marcos de la Vida Eterna church during the middle of Mass. They gather up a number of the younger congregants and bring them back to the site where Item 001 is housed. The researchers quickly ran through their new supply of test subjects though, and Omega-5 would need to get even more if their research was to continue. Instead of going back and forth between the testing facility and San Marcos, 051 decided to move the entire Item 001 operation to the town itself. He renames the town Testing Site 001, and Omega-5 rounds up 23 of the healthiest subjects they can find for use in the next series of research tests. A few weeks after occupying the town of San Marco, Omega-5 makes its most substantial progress yet. Just as they theorized, by spreading out the anomaly of Item 001 across a specific group of hosts, they can control its powers. The test may have cost the lives of almost everyone in the town, but the ends certainly justify the means. The Kingdom of Abaddon poses an existential threat to the SCP Foundation after all, and thanks to this research, they will soon have a weapon capable of bringing them victory. The Foundation Administrator criticized 051's methods, but can't argue with his results. Unfortunately, 051 has a dark secret, a secret that disturbs even the most hardened and loyal members of Omega-5. A secret that has to do with the Item 001 hosts. The hosts that Omega-5 has made its major progress with are not the ordinary test subjects normally used by the Foundation. No, the test subjects 051 makes his breakthrough with are children. 9 of them, to be exact, all between 4 and 11 years old. Despite being told specifically by the Foundation Administrator to only test on adults, the research required 051 to break the chain of command and follow the science down the path it led. The children are contained in a reinforced bunker where only 051 and a select few have access. They are technically alive, but are functionally brain dead. The group of 9 children share a hive mind that can process information, and more importantly, can unleash the full potential of the implanted anomaly, creating and controlling a devastating power. But not everyone is thrilled with what they've achieved. Members of Omega-5 are haunted by the screams of the children that they forced to be part of their weapons development program. They describe their merging with Item 001 as being a process that rips out their souls and replaces them with something much more sinister. In fact, all of Omega-5 regret what they have been a part of and what they've done, all except 051. The 9 children can channel unprecedented amounts of energy from an unknown origin that Omega-5 hypothesizes comes from an extra-dimensional source, which is then used to unbind atoms at the quantum level. When the right activation words are spoken, it appears as though this tremendous power gives the children the ability to annihilate anything in the entire universe. It's a gun to end all guns, and only 051 has the key to control it. The 9 children work so well with an Item 001 that Omega-5 reclassifies it to include the 9 children themselves. They are not just the entity housing or controlling Item 001, they permanently become Item 001. Once Omega-5 has a better understanding of Item 001, they begin to run tests to find out the full extent of its abilities. First, they test the distance Item 001 can reach. The initial test that Omega-5 carries out is on a steel rod placed 5 kilometers away. 051 orders the children to destroy the target. Moments later, the phone next to 051 begins to ring. When he picks it up, the observer tasked with watching the pole is on the other end. He informs 051 that the steel rod has been completely vaporized. 051 is not satisfied though. He has another pole sent out, this time placed 8,000 kilometers away from the 9 children. 051 asks the children to destroy that rod. Almost immediately, the phone rings again. The target has been vaporized. 051 smiles. The next series of tests Omega-5 runs on Item 001 are to determine the maximum size of an object that can be destroyed. The tests start out with a steel sphere, 3 meters in diameter, placed 1,000 kilometers from Item 001. 051 orders the children to destroy the object. It is instantly vaporized. 051 has seen enough small tests. It's time for something big. So he does something that will later be questioned by everyone at the SCP Foundation. He orders the 9 children to destroy a Church of the Broken God worship site in Turkey. Not long after the destruction order is given to Item 001, reports begin coming in. The worship site has been obliterated with no observable damage to the surrounding area. Deadly and precise. 051 closes his eyes and takes a deep breath. He looks as if he's overcome by an immense spiritual experience. He opens his eyes, leans over to the children, and whispers the name of someone. Later that day, 051 finds out that the target he had named has been vaporized. The success of Omega-5 and Item 001 is relayed to the administration of the Foundation. They are so impressed that they make plans to use Item 001 to eliminate the Abaddon threat once and for all. However, one of the heads of the Foundation, Administrator Williams, has major concerns about the way 051 is running the program. The updates that 051 has been sending have become less scientific and more philosophical, more spiritual. Administrator Williams sends a letter to 051 reassuring him that he is doing good work. But once the mission to destroy the Kingdom of Abaddon is completed, 051 will be promoted to Director and reassigned to the newly constructed Site-19. For the good of the Foundation, and maybe the rest of the world, he'll be permanently moved away from Item 001. 051's response is short and to the point. I am fine, Administrator. The project is finished. We will complete our task when you arrive. Administrator Williams arrives at Site-001 a few days later. He is greeted by 051 and the Omega-5 team. Williams can't help but notice that 051 has a strange look in his eyes. It is the look of a crazed man who has been lost in his work and who has, perhaps, lost himself. Williams puts the thought away, though, and walks with 051 and his accompanying agents to the viewing area, where the powers of Item 001 will be demonstrated. Administrator Williams and the other agents watch from a protected viewing room as 051 enters the chamber of his new superweapon. It's time to see if their weapon that has had so much time, effort, sweat, tears, and especially blood poured into it will have been worth it. Everyone watches as 051 leans over and says the name of the Abaddon Citadel to the 9 children. All at once, they start to glow. No one observing can see what has happened in the far-off kingdom, but they know something big has happened. The administrator is thrilled, but notices something. 051 hesitated a moment while leaning over the children before standing back up. Did he whisper something else to them? And then Administrator Williams vaporizes, pulled apart at an atomic level before he has the chance to scream. What's going on? The agents standing next to where Administrator Williams previously existed begin to yell and pull out their guns. They burst through the door of the observation room and run down the hallway towards where 051 and the 9 children are located. The arm agents rush into the room, but 051 is gone. The 9 children are still. Over the next few weeks, 051 is reported to be seen several times by SCP agents. However, no one is able to catch him, and it appears as though other members of the SCP Foundation have also gone AWOL as well, perhaps joining him on the run. It is unclear what his plan is, but the reports from the reconnaissance team sent into the Sahara make it obvious what the result of his first command to the children was. There isn't a single humanoid or building left in the Kingdom of Abaddon. But even with this victory, the highest levels of the SCP Foundation have an ominous thought lurking in the back of their minds. Where did 051 go? And what is he planning to do next? Following the improper use of Item 001 leading to the untimely death of a high-ranking Foundation staff member, the weapon was deemed too dangerous and containment procedures were implemented. Due to the high amount of radiation they were found to emit, the 9 children were placed into lead-lined bags and buried under 50 meters of concrete beneath the Church of San Marcos de la Vida Eterna. Though all of the children continued to be functionally brain-dead, they still display signs of life despite their containment, and by order of the Overseer Council, have been classified as a thaumial entity. The SCP Foundation deals with plenty of different groups of interest. Cults, rival agencies, criminal organizations, all of which have some connection to anomalous artifacts and creatures. But there are some groups of interest who actually are responsible for the creation of anomalies. And a few are as weird and intriguing as the Dr. Wondertainment toy company. Whether or not Dr. Wondertainment is a real person or not is the subject of much speculation. But whoever they are, the company that bears their name has produced a multitude of dangerous anomalous items that are currently in Foundation containment. Usually these anomalies take the form of highly dangerous toys, But the company has also released a very peculiar set of limited edition creations, a set of 21 living, breathing, more or less human beings known collectively as the Little Misters. All of them are marked by tattoos of their name, and each comes with a card reading, "Wow, you've just found yourself your very own Little Mister, a limited edition collection from Dr. Wondertainment. Find them all and become Mr. Collector." Let's take a look and see what's out there before you try and catch them all. SCP-005, or Mr. Chameleon, is a living being made up entirely of photons. His form is described as fuzzy but definite, and he appears to be the rough shape of a human male standing at approximately 175 centimeters in height. He has no mass due to being made solely of light particles, at least not one we can measure. And while he can move and speak, he cannot manipulate objects in the world around him. Mr. Chameleon, as his name suggests, can alter the wavelength of the light coming from his body in order to match the color of his environment. He also has the ability to walk through any transparent material. SCP-2287, or Mr. Headless, is a human male who is mostly normal aside from his lack of a head. Mr. Headless is blind, but can somehow still speak and hear, and does not need to eat. Spending time around Mr. Headless can cause people to experience dissociative episodes where they begin to see themselves as headless as well. In an interview, Mr. Headless claims to have been created for use as a Halloween decoration, with his dissociative effect on others being intended as a kind of spooky prank, even if it does sound more like a form of torture. Mr. Headless was found by the Foundation wandering the streets of a Wisconsin town after he left an attic where he had been kept with other holiday decorations. SCP-1799, or Mr. Laugh, is a human male standing 120 centimeters tall, who has the physical characteristics of a classic circus clown, complete with gray and white skin, a red nose, and comically long feet. He is capable of communication, but everything he says will be interpreted by those around him as a joke. No matter what he says, people around him will start to laugh, and the more he talks, the more people laugh. In some cases, they can even laugh themselves to death. For example, one D-Class personnel used to test the effects of Mr. Laugh started laughing so hard that he lost his balance and suffered a fatal cranial injury. SCP-909, or Mr. Forgetful, is a man with retrograde amnesia. He appears aware of his condition and cannot seem to recall any of his own memories. The only way that information appears able to enter Mr. Forgetful's long-term memory is if he writes it down. However, when he does so, something strange happens. The memory he's just written down is instantly forgotten by anyone else who was involved in the events. SCP-3537, or Mr. Shapey, is an amorphous humanoid that changes shape, though this transformation happens involuntarily. All of Mr. Shapey's transformations are into non-anomalous human beings, and they have been seen taking their own notes on possible anomalous properties each new persona could have. They describe these transformations as painful, with the level of pain varying dependent on how dramatic the change is. Despite the pain, Mr. Shapey says they're happy the way they are. In an interview, they claim to be the first of the Little Misters, and their random transformations were used as inspiration for the appearance of all the subsequent Little Mister designs. SCP-1908, or Mr. Soap, is a man who constantly produces soapy water, which will quickly fill up any area he's in and cause all surrounding surfaces to become slippery. The soap can be easily cleaned up with normal methods, but the levels of liquid being produced by Mr. Soap's body have to be constantly monitored. When the Foundation discovered him, he was in a factory in China where he had been put to work cleaning the machinery. SCP-913, or Mr. Hungry, is a middle-aged African-American male wearing a dress shirt and pants, who is capable of eating almost any material. Mr. Hungry is given nutrients intravenously and must be provided with a full day's worth of calories every 2 hours, or else he will enter a hunger trance. While in this trance state, he is capable of biting with a force of up to 5,000 newtons and will devour anything and everything around him. His metabolism is so fast that drugs and toxins have no effect on him. including amnestics and anesthesia. SCP-629, or Mr. Brass, is a massive brass automaton, standing at 170 centimeters and weighing 500 kilograms. All parts of Mr. Brass's body are removable and can be rearranged with only mild discomfort to Mr. Brass himself. Projections show that there are at least 73 billion possible combinations of Mr. Brass's body parts. When Mr. Brass was discovered by the Foundation, he had been taken in by the Church of the Broken God, who believed him to be a religious idol and worshipped him as a deity. SCP-644, or Mr. Hot, is a man who can both accurately guess the number of children that any person has, biological or otherwise, and predict the material wishes of any child. He also claims to be able to accurately predict the popularity of any product aimed at children. When approached, he will offer a business card that identifies him as Dr. Wondertainment's marketing consultant. He was found sleeping in the hallway of a school in Racine, Wisconsin, a town that was later found to contain many children with anomalous Wondertainment toys in their possession. In interviews, Mr. Hot describes his job as being able to identify which children would get the most use out of a Wondertainment toy. In his own words,
"You can't just give this kind of craftsmanship to just anybody. You give the average kid a realistic race car, he's just gonna go leave it on a shelf and go stare at the sun or something."
SCP-2396, or Miss Sweetie, is a female humanoid who stands at 250 centimeters tall and weighs 101 kilograms. She lives entirely on sugar and foods containing sugar, and claims to be in pain when denied her sweet fuel. She has a repellent effect on males, a feature which she says is meant to keep nasty brothers and their friends out. Anomalous hard candies will appear at random anywhere in a 6-kilometer radius of Miss Sweetie's location. When ingested by females, the candies are perfectly harmless, but any masculine-presenting humans who eat them start to undergo transformation into a being made entirely of living candy. These candy entities are resistant to blunt force trauma, but can be easily dispatched with fire and will obey any command given to them by any person who identifies as female. SCP-1007, or Mr. Life, is a male humanoid who goes through the entire human life cycle every 75 minutes, aging at a rate of 1 year per minute. Mr. Life has a keyhole in his back that, when a key is inserted into it, can reverse the aging process. Each turn of the key regresses Mr. Life 1 year younger until he's fully regressed to a newborn baby. Mr. Life was seized from a California mansion after he had been purchased at an auction held by Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited, another group of interests that provides the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world with objects and experiences that would otherwise be impossible without the help of the anomalies they trade in. Other Little Misters were also sold at the auction, though the buyer of Mr. Life couldn't recall who they were or exactly which Little Misters they had bought. The tattoo on Mr. Life's back reads Mr. Life and Mr. Death, which may imply that Mr. Life has a counterpart that the Foundation has not yet been able to identify. SCP-527, or Mr. Fish, is a non-anomalous man with no physical abnormalities of any kind, save for the fact that he has the head of a fish. He was discovered in Boston in 2002 and moved to Site-19 in 2004. In his initial interview with Foundation researcher Dr. Baker, Mr. Fish was very frank and upfront about his lack of interesting qualities.
"Like I told the other guy, this is all it is. You're looking at it. Lies, thrives, hot, sweetie, they got all the good stuff. I'm just the guy with the fish head."
SCP-917, or Mr. Moon, is an elderly man whose facial features wax and wane in time with the lunar cycle. On nights when the moon is full, his face is normal, and his face is completely blank on nights with a new moon. This is painless for Mr. Moon, but he does lose his sense of sight, hearing, and smell when his face is in its new moon state, and he claims that the experience leaves him very tired. SCP-2855, or Mr. Money, is a Latin American man who is anomalously affected by any business transactions regarding his ownership. As soon as any person exchanges money for ownership of Mr. Money and creates any kind of written proof of that ownership, Mr. Money will be teleported to their location. Mr. Money's abilities are also subject to the beliefs of whoever claims ownership of him, and will display any anomalous properties that are written as part of his contract. Mr. Money was recovered in 2007, taken from the holdings of Marshall Carter and Dark LLP, a branch of the same company that had previously sold Mr. Life. When Mr. Money was discovered, MC&D had been selling and buying him back repeatedly in order to test his adaptive capabilities. SCP-920, or Mr. Lost, is an Asian man in a green hoodie who seems to do nothing but wander aimlessly. Transportation and containment of Mr. Lost are impossible, as any attempts to do so can result in a variety of natural disasters and other destructive phenomena. He has a kind of psychic pull on those around him, who feel compelled to walk and talk with him. Mr. Lost doesn't seem to suffer from any environmental effects, as he has been spotted wandering deserts and tundra with no apparent harm coming to him whatsoever. SCP-2284, or Mr. Lai, is a man of Indian descent whose voice has a cognitohazardous effect on anyone who hears it. Any statement that Mr. Lai says will be perceived as true, despite the fact that Mr. Lai is physically incapable of telling the truth. Because of this, Mr. Lai communicates mainly via rhetorical questions, which is the only way he can express what he means. SCP-2428-1, or Mr. Mad, is a man in a multicolored straitjacket who can only be seen by those possessing the document designated SCP-2428, a document which serves as proof of purchase. Mr. Mad is essentially an imaginary friend who can only be seen by the lone person in possession of the SCP-2428 document. In interviews, Mr. Mad expresses a belief that he was a real person once, before being rendered imaginary by Dr. Wondertainment. In fact, there is evidence to suggest many of the Little Misters were once ordinary people. SCP-2933 is a partially submerged steel structure located in a saltwater reservoir, a structure which contains SCP-2933-A, or Mr. Scary. The interior of SCP-2933 is constantly changing, and seems to move and shift in a way that directs anyone who enters towards Mr. Scary. Once inside the structure, there is no way back to the entrance. Despite his name and despite the sense of dread surrounding the steel structure, Mr. Scary doesn't seem interested in scaring people. He self-identifies as Mr. Smiles and seems to have the personality of a young child. His body is, like his containment, covered in rust, a condition which he claims was transferred to him by his father and which he says is very painful. While he does have a tattoo naming him Mr. Smiles, a rusted patch of his skin appears to have been marked with Mr. Scary, property of the factory, suggesting that they may have had something to do with his rusted condition. SCP-2148, or Mr. Stripes, is a man wearing a white blindfold. If the blindfold is removed, anything that Mr. Stripes tries to commit to memory, whether that's a passage of text, a scene from a movie, or a person's face, becomes censored by large black bars in all existing records. Mr. Stripes refers to Mr. Lai as his brother, and believes himself to be the first Little Mister, although he was told that by Mr. Lai, so take it with a grain of salt. Based on Mr. Stripes' testimony, Mr. Lai spent a lot of time with him, traveling around and making use of their combined abilities to break into secure government buildings. Even though they were close, Mr. Stripes has never directly looked at Mr. Lai. As he tells it, Dr. Wondertainment told him they weren't supposed to look at Mr. Lai yet. And then last but not least is Mr. Red, who has not been given a designation and is listed as a discontinued Little Mister. His story is a topic that would take an entire video to explain altogether, but he may just be the most violent, powerful, and dangerous of all the Little Misters. As interesting as the Little Misters are, they're not the only anomalous creatures of the mysterious Dr. Wondertainment. So let us know in the comments if you'd like to hear more about this twisted toy maker. After all, nothing makes you feel more like a child at heart than running in terror from a Dr. Wondertainment original. You're driving down a long highway, lost in an area you don't know too well, trying to find the right turn that'll have you heading back towards your home. You keep driving, the nighttime quiet all around you. Deciding to try and break that silence, you reach for the radio, turning the dial to filter through all the garbled, distorted voices and songs from nearby local radio stations that are too far out of range to come through clearly. You try your best to listen to the music from one radio station, but eventually the sound of the static only makes you wish for the silence you were trying to break. Your fingers nudge the tuning dial on your car radio once again, and finally, something comes through. It isn't loud or clear, but under the distortion, you can make out the sound, and it isn't a song or even a late news broadcast. The first thing you hear sounds like a short musical tone, only for about 10 seconds. Next, a young girl's voice speaking in a language you don't understand, even through the distorted audio. From her accent, you assume it's Russian, but you still have no idea what the words she's saying mean. With nothing else to listen to, you let the broadcast play. Still driving alone in the dark with nothing but the strange adolescent voice to accompany you, your mind begins to wander. She sounds like she's speaking something, but the rhythm of the words is somehow familiar to you, even though you don't speak Russian. Then it hits you. She's counting, but you don't feel smart for having worked that out. Instead, something about knowing that makes your blood run cold. You carry on driving through the night. After a few short minutes, the Russian girl stops counting, and the musical tone plays again under the distortion, leaving you alone in the car once again, with nothing but your thoughts and questions of what exactly you just heard. Thankfully, we have the answer. What you heard was SCP-3034. Since 1964, this same broadcast has been made a vast number of times, 627 times in fact. You'd have to be within 2 kilometers of the broadcast's point of origin to hear it, where Foundation personnel have tried and failed numerous times to triangulate its source. The numbers heard recited in the SCP-3034 broadcast are actually a countdown from 200, read aloud in Russian. All Foundation staff are able to do while stationed at the nearby Provisional Site 3034 is scour radio frequencies for occurrences of SCP-3034. Checking their equipment is properly maintained and calibrated before they are eventually rotated off-site and replaced with a new group of staff. There is only one rule that any Foundation members working at Provisional Site 3034 must follow. They are only permitted to send one radio transmission with their equipment, a single phrase in reply to the SCP-3034 broadcast. Vizyo Harashu. Receiving this, the countdown stops and the broadcast ends, but never permanently. SCP-3034 has been known to repeatedly occur, seemingly at random. The shortest recorded gap between broadcasts was 2 weeks, while the longest so far lasted 6 whole months. You may have heard the term number station mentioned before, but these are far from just random numerical sequences sent out over the airwaves without purpose. General speculation surrounding number stations points to them being the tools of espionage agents, a way of sending coded, highly sensitive messages or information without the risk of compromising their cover. The use of number station transmissions is often attributed to spies working on foreign soil, who utilize shortwave radio frequencies, speech synthesis, Morse code, and either regular or sporadic timing schedules. While it's true that times have changed and technology has progressed considerably, there appears to be evidence that number stations are still used among various intelligence and espionage agencies today. Despite being considered an old-fashioned method of communication, these low-tech shortwave stations remain a viable, reliable option for the transmission and reception of intelligence to field agents. The CONET project is a comprehensive archive of this phenomenon, and its founder, Aiken Fernandez, has long been fascinated by number stations. According to him, this system is completely secure because the messages can't be tracked. The recipient could be anywhere. You just send spies to the country and get them to buy a radio. They know where to tune and when. So what does the distorted broadcast of numbers from SCP-3034 mean? Is it the work of covert agents? And if so, whose side are they on? Most importantly, why does the SCP Foundation make certain there are always 3 of its personnel on site, ready to send the all-is-well message whenever SCP-3034 begins broadcasting? SCP-3034 was first discovered by the Foundation in 1964, after a defector from the Soviet GRUP, a division tasked with acquiring and studying anomalies on behalf of the USSR, gave them a tip. Commander Robert Malthus, along with a team of 6, including a man named Agent Browning, selected for his knowledge of Russian dialects, were sent to investigate at Provisional Site 3034. Here, the team uncovered partially burned records and logbooks, all kept in Russian, along with evidence that the site had been evacuated shortly before their arrival. Carved into a desk, also in Russian, were 2 phrases: "Don't let her finish," and "Tell her all is well." On the team's second day at the site, an automated alarm sounded at 7:30 a.m., alerting them to the incoming SCP-3034 broadcast. Following the instructions on the desk, Agent Browning was able to stop the broadcast, telling the young Russian girl that all was well. A tape was partially recovered by the team from the site and translated from Russian. The GRUP members that had previously inhabited the station had interrogated one of their own, a man named Sergei, whom they accused of stealing state property. "She's not state property," he replied. "She has a name." While his GRUP superior accused Sergei of planning to defect to the United States, allegedly in exchange for money and asylum, Sergei denied any collusion with America. He claimed that the GRUP at Provisional Site 3034 were meddling with powers they could not possibly hope to understand. His superior, a man named Vaslov, dismissed this, claiming their work to be no different to the United States experimentation with atomic weapons at the time. "One does not make deals with atom bombs," Sergei argued. "One certainly does not sacrifice little girls to them." Shortly after this, a struggle broke out, with Sergei having to be restrained while urging Vaslov to cease any and all interference with it. The man spoke of terrible nightmares that he'd had, voices screaming in the darkness. "That's what it wants, Vaslov. That's what it is. You cannot make a deal with this thing. We have finally contained it, and now you want to offer it." The tape's audio ends shortly after this point, with no clear answer as to what Sergei was referring to, or what offer these Russian operatives had made to it. Ever since the discovery of SCP-3034, members of the SCP Foundation have worked tirelessly to understand the purpose of these countdowns, as well as determine their origin. By September 2012, Dr. Shulkill was reaching the end of his tether with the investigation into the SCP-3034 broadcast. Over almost half a century, the Foundation had made well over 600 recordings of the Russian girls' countdowns, but still hadn't determined any noteworthy information. They were prohibited from contacting the girl via the same radio frequency, only permitted to use the phrase that stopped her countdowns. Running out of options, Shulkill contacted his colleague, Dr. Emerson, asking for an in-depth vocal analysis of the various recordings of SCP-3034, even if they could narrow down where the broadcast was coming from, maybe by determining the girl's geographical location from her dialect. Then that would be at least some slight progress into understanding SCP-3034. While unable to discover the girl's location, Dr. Emerson's analysis did yield some interesting findings. Emerson learned that these countdowns were not pre-recorded. The variations in the Russian girl's voice, her tone, her pitch, all seemed to indicate that every instance of the broadcast was unique. Rather than use the same recording, this girl had been counting down over and over hundreds of times for almost 50 years. But there was more. Shulkill and Emerson then examined the distortion, the sounds interfering with the audio of the Russian girl's countdowns. What had initially seemed like garbled static seemed to actually be additional voices. And much like the girl's voice, these distorted voices were unique, different in every broadcast. However, Shulkill and Emerson were unable to accurately determine what these voices were saying. Given that the girls' countdowns were always cut short by the use of the phrase, "all is well," the doctors did not have long enough samples of the audio to analyze the other distorted voices. With permission from the Foundation, the next 5 occurrences of the SCP-3034 broadcast were allowed to carry on for longer, giving the 2 doctors enough audio to determine exactly what the distorted voices were. And the results were extremely troubling. They were screams. Thousands upon thousands of children's voices endlessly screaming. Both Dr. Emerson and Dr. Shulkill agreed that it would be best to continue responding to SCP-3034 with the correct phrase, and refused to analyze the distorted screaming audio any further. 3 years later, while stationed at Provisional Site 3034, a Foundation researcher named Dr. Uriel Willis decided to take matters into her own hands. she conducted an experiment that had not been sanctioned by the Foundation and attempted to make contact with the Russian girl giving the countdowns. Hearing Dr. Willis's voice, the girl stopped her countdown. After 5 long, painfully silent seconds, a new broadcast was heard. A piercing, high-pitched screech that caused extreme pain and dizziness to all the staff working on site. Unable to bear the disorienting sound, Dr. Willis told the girl all is well and caused the noise to stop. The following day, SCP researchers noted that there had been a significant increase in cases of missing children all around the world. A majority of these disappearances happened at the same time the screech had been broadcast and remain unsolved to this day. Dr. Willis faced disciplinary action from the SCP Foundation, and any further testing of SCP-3034 and attempts to communicate with the Russian girl were prohibited. Only one distinct change has been noted in the SCP-3034 broadcast since this incident. Almost a month later, the countdown was detected and the correct phrase given, but researchers noted that, instead of starting her countdown from 200, this time the Russian girl began counting down from 199. Nobody knows what will happen if the Russian girl's countdown is allowed to reach 0. Personnel working at Provisional Site 3034 are told to always offer her the necessary phrase before this point in the countdown. Attempting to interfere with the broadcast by contacting this girl directly not only resulted in intense pain for SCP staff, but also seems to have caused an unconfirmed number of child disappearances around the globe, as well as reducing the countdown starting number from 200 to 199. After a long night on the road, you finally find the right turn, sending you in the right direction. As you drive through the night, you keep telling yourself one thing, one small phrase over and over again. You hope the words will eventually give you comfort, but deep down you start to realize just how hollow they are. That it's just a lie we tell ourselves so we don't have to face the inevitable. But still, what choice do you have but to keep telling yourself that all is well?
As we all know, the SCP Foundation secures, contains, and protects the various anomalies under its custody. But their mission isn't limited to just grabbing the object and chucking it into a containment locker at the bottom of a classified site deep below the surface of the Earth. The Foundation wants to get a comprehensive, full understanding of all the strange items, creatures, and humanoids in its custody, because that's the only way to understand what they're capable of, what danger they pose, and how to effectively contain them. That much is logical. But the problem is that there's no global scientific community surrounding anomalies, at least not ones willing to cooperate with the Foundation. Perhaps the Chaos Insurgency or Global Occult Coalition have some scientists who have studied anomalies, or the various government agencies that know about the anomalous world like the Unusual Incidents Unit or Soviet GRUP. But for the most part, the Foundation is utterly alone when it comes to figuring out how these anomalies work, what they are, and how to combat them. So the Foundation does what any institution would do: experiments. Many of the Foundation's most important and iconic anomalies are defined by the experiments the white-coated scientists have performed on them, sometimes even using human subjects through the notorious and infamous D-Class program. Everyone knows about how SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy lizard, has been subjected to practically every known weapon and attack under the sun in an attempt to kill the highly dangerous, hateful predator. And who can forget SCP-914, the Clockworks, and the countless objects the Foundation has put through it on its 5 settings to see what it spits out. Needless to say, the Foundation's experiments are incredibly important to how the organization functions, so those SCPs that can offer lots of testing options are very treasured and prized, along with being iconic and legendary throughout the Foundation. Today we're going to be looking at one such anomaly, but not a dangerous, hostile, man-eating predator like SCP-682, or a mysterious eldritch machine like SCP-914. No, today we're going to be looking at something much more simpler than that. A coffee machine. Yes, today we're going to be inspecting SCP-294, affectionately referred to by guards and personnel as the coffee machine. Though you probably don't want to order a hot cup of joe in this coffee machine lest you, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The first thing you see when you open the SCP-294 file is its number, of course. Item 294, Object Class Euclid. The next thing you see is the image. If you were imagining a tiny little coffee maker before, this should get rid of that. SCP-294 is big, the kind of coffee machine you'd see in a factory break room. It's almost the size of a vending machine and has a big colored window showing a few cups of coffee, along with the slots for cash and coins so drinkers can pay for their espressos. But the most notable feature on SCP-294 is the full keyboard on the front panel. It's a typical QWERTY keyboard, just like yours, with a spacebar and everything. Why on earth would a coffee machine need a keyboard? The special containment procedures paint an interesting picture, by which we mean there aren't any. SCP-294 doesn't need any special procedures, secret rituals, or complex machines to keep it contained. But it's still Euclid. So only personnel who have security clearance of level 2 or higher are allowed to interact with it at the moment. This is surprising when you realize that SCP-294 is currently being held not in an anomalous item locker or containment cell, but exactly where you'd expect to find a big coffee machine, a break room. Specifically the Site-19 second floor personnel break room. But it's not alone. It's monitored by 2 guards with level 3 clearance around the clock. For them, sitting in the break room all day guarding a coffee machine that can't move and is too heavy to lift has to be a pretty sweet gig, considering what other kinds of jobs are available at the Foundation. But all that raises even more mysteries. What the heck is up with this coffee machine? The description starts off obvious enough. Affirmed that yes, SCP-294 is indeed a standard coffee vending machine, but with the difference we all noticed earlier. Instead of a simple button list of options, it has a full keyboard on it, each button aligning with the letter on a real keyboard. And when someone slips 50 cents into the coin slot, quite a bargain for coffee if you ask me, the user gets a message on screen prompting them to enter the name of what liquid they'd like. You type it in on the keyboard, and that's that. The machine drops a little paper cup, and a nozzle shoots out 12 fluid ounces of whatever you requested. Pretty nifty, isn't it? But it gets niftier. Most people would only think to ask a coffee machine for, well, coffee. But SCP-294 accepts any liquid, and some things that aren't liquids. When the Foundation initially got their hands on it, they ran no less than 97 tests on it, after they realized they weren't just limited to espressos and cappuccinos. At first, any kind of liquid you could drink was requested. The researchers popped in requests for water, coffee, beer, soda, milkshakes, and out they came. Then they decided to get a little more creative. They started to request things you couldn't possibly drink, not if you wanted to stay alive. Sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, like the kind SCP-682 is suspended in. Wiper fluid, motor oil. But SCP-294 stubbornly provided, even if the liquids would melt through the researchers' throats like a knife through butter. Then the researchers decided to apply some of their scientific knowledge. There are a lot of chemical compounds that don't usually exist in a liquid state on planet Earth's surface. They typed in nitrogen, iron, and glass, among others, and received shimmering liquids in paper cups. They sent them off to a lab for analysis and, wouldn't you know it, chemically identical to nitrogen, iron, and glass. But when they typed in diamond, no doubt wondering whether they'd found an infinite cash cow, they received an error message on the screen. It seemed that while SCP-294 could deliver substances that aren't usually in a liquid state on Earth's surface, it needed to be at least possible for the substance to be in a pure liquid form for SCP-294 to dispense it. Since diamond is only a mineral, it couldn't be dispensed. Then they tried to test something else, and got a slightly disturbing response on the small LCD display. Out of stock. It stopped responding to requests for over an hour, then made a small noise and began to accept requests again. It appears that the machine can take about 50 requests before needing to take an hour and a half to restock itself. And while only the machine is anomalous, the small 12-ounce paper cups it dispenses its liquids in seems remarkably hardy. Substances that would have eaten through paper instantly, like the sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid, had no effect on these little cups, though the same can be said for those that drank from them. One of the researchers had a great idea. Here was an anomaly that was practically harmless, and could be a great little way for the Foundation to scale back its budget a little bit. They proposed putting SCP-294 into the break room it currently resides in, both to more easily conduct experiments and to save money when agents and doctors came in for lunch and needed a quick drink, or in the mornings where everyone was looking for coffee to wake them up. With no good reason not to, the machine was put in the break room, but not long after, an unfortunate incident occurred. One with enough harm that it was deemed necessary that only personnel with security clearance interact with SCP-294. What could have happened to cause this? Did someone burn themselves on hot coffee? Did the vending machine accidentally crush someone? No. The reality is much darker. One morning in August of 2005, Agent Joseph, whose full name has been redacted to preserve their identity, went up to the vending machine in the break room, looking to get a hot cup of coffee to wake himself up between shifts. Another agent in the room who was on break at the time saw him and made a suggestion to find out what SCP-294 would do when given the colloquial name rather than the exact real name of a drink. They just wanted to see what would happen. So Agent Joseph slipped in 2 quarters and typed in a hot cup of Joe. Seconds after, he began sweating like a pig. He was feeling very hot, even though the break room was fully air-conditioned, and his skin began to flush. He then clutched his head, complaining that he was dizzy, and the whole room was spinning around before collapsing to the floor. The other agent immediately called the medical staff, who moved Agent Joseph to the infirmary and stabilized him. Once they made sure he wasn't in any real trouble, they also grabbed whatever SCP-294 had spit out. It was a disgusting, thick, reddish-brown liquid with a strong stench, and when they ran the labs on it, they confirmed it was exactly what they thought it was: a mixture of blood, tissue, bone marrow, cerebrospinal fluid, and other bodily fluids that was an exact DNA match for Agent Joseph. SCP-294 somehow managed to literally liquefy 12 ounces from the agent's body before producing them into a cup. This offered a clue. Maybe it stole the liquids it was asked for from the nearest source. In any case, the agent was released after a few weeks of bed rest and care to make sure he wasn't further injured, and both involved agents were reprimanded. With the knowledge of how accidentally dangerous SCP-294 can be, who can blame the Foundation for wanting to keep a careful lid on it? Researchers were curious, though, and received clearance to test the SCP's abilities to retrieve specific liquids from long distances. With an O5's approval and oversight, they input a cup of SCP-075's secretion. SCP-075, the corrosive snail, is exactly what it sounds like: a gross little creature that secretes a highly caustic acid, capable of melting almost anything. Without fail, the coffee machine dispensed the secretion into the cup, and the cup stayed perfectly intact. But at the very same time, in SCP-075's cell, the creature woke up and began secreting acid that immediately disappeared. All in all, about 12 ounces, the same amount in the cup. Based off of these results, further testing with SCP-294 was approved. One researcher tried punching in a request for a cup of gold. What came out was a small paper cup of molten gold that quickly cooled to room temperature. Asking for cups of silver and platinum produced similar results, but based off of previous tests, it seemed clear that the machine wasn't creating precious metals, so much as siphoning them off from somewhere else. The next request was a strange one: a cup of anti-water. The machine took a moment, then printed a small message on its LCD display: out of range. This confirmed that the machine couldn't produce substances that didn't actually exist, and couldn't break physics to get its materials by peering into alternate universes, dimensions, or realities. After that, the researchers tested for diamond, and got the result that you already know of: an out-of-range error. Some more investigation showed that all solid substances that don't have a liquid form get this error, but asking for a cup of liquid carbon produced exactly that, because liquid carbon isn't the same thing as a diamond, though both are made of carbon. SCP-294 clearly has more knowledge of chemistry than some of us. Then the researchers created an entirely new drink, made of bleach, various sodas, protein powders, and spices. They blended it together and put it in a jar across the room from SCP-294. When requested, The amount of the liquid in the cup was missing from the jar, proving that SCP-294 doesn't actually create its own liquids. But how does SCP-294 react when presented with a more subjective request? One researcher asked for the best drink I've ever had. After a moment, the paper cup filled with something that looked like cola, but the researcher said it tasted like a drink he had years ago at a party and that he'd always remembered as his favorite drink, though he couldn't say what was in it. But that was a subjective test, and the researchers repeated it with a different subject. When an agent also requested the best drink I've ever had, the machine produced a simple Vienna lager with a label showing a group of people drinking it at the beach and no brand name. The agent confirmed that the best drink he ever had was a Vienna lager at the beach with his friends. So SCP-294 could not only read people's minds, it can read memories they don't even know they still have. Another one they tried was something Cassie will like, referencing SCP-085, the young girl who lived in a drawn-on world. The cup dispensed was completely empty, but it had a small drawing printed on the side of a soda glass with brown and white things floating on top of each other. The researchers presented the cup to Cassie and were told by her it was a chocolate banana milkshake, and a delicious one at that. A cup of music was a strange request and produced an even stranger result. A clear, odorless carbonated drink that tasted vaguely alcoholic. When drunk, subjects said they could feel it and started showing an affinity to music, being able to sing and dance to a rhythm when they had no sense of rhythm or were tone-deaf before. Whether SCP-294 can produce even more abstract concepts is still under study, but was interrupted by the next test. An unfortunate containment breach incident at Site-19 left several personnel trapped in the break room, heavily injured while MTFs fought to re-establish control over the site. An agent typed in a cup of medical knowledge, and the machine quickly produced a green liquid. After drinking it, the agent was able to treat the injuries of their fellow personnel consistent with standard first responder practices, and was commended for their bravery. But their knowledge didn't stick around after the breach, and attempts to recreate the liquid failed. They decided that SCP-294 broke its own rules for self-preservation in the emergency, implying that it's not only sentient, it is intelligent. A doctor using SCP-294 made a request close to him: my life story. While nowhere close to a drink, SCP-294 seemed to accept the input, until it started shaking violently and making odd noises. It remained in this new state for about 3 minutes, then returned to normal, spitting out a completely opaque black fluid, like tar, in a cup. Despite the strange reaction, the doctor drank the fluid and immediately informed the others he was now able to remember everything that had ever happened to him, from the smallest childhood event to the most important events in his adult life. He excused himself and disappeared into his office. The next time the staff saw him 2 days later, he was carrying an autobiography 600 pages long. Then the researchers decided to try their luck and input "surprise me." The resulting solution was a cup containing what seemed to be regular water, right until a researcher touched it. It was just water, all right, but it had been superheated to 200 degrees Celsius while remaining in liquid form. The moment someone touched it, bang! It violently evaporated into steam, spraying boiling water everywhere. Not only does SCP-294 have intelligence, it has a sense of humor, albeit a quite rude one. The next 3 requests were for blood, namely blood of the Smilodon, or saber-toothed tiger, of the passenger pigeon, and of Founding Father Thomas Jefferson. But the only thing SCP-294 produced were out-of-range errors, confirming it can't take liquids that don't exist anymore. But in the next test, blood was received from wolves, saliva was received from horses, urine was received from koalas, and cerebral spinal fluid was received from Phoebromus pattersoni, a rodent that went extinct some 8 million years ago. Though if SCP-294 is working according to its own rules, it means that there may be still one in the wild somehow. For the next test, the researchers decided to get back to the scientific roots of it all. They made a request for a cup of D-151839's leukemia, knowing that the D-class in question had a very advanced case of cancer. The machine outputted it without any trouble, and analysis of the liquid showed it contained cancer cells that matched the D-class's DNA. but another request for the same spat out an out-of-range error. What's more, a medical checkup on the D class revealed that their tumor was completely gone, but unfortunately it was only a short-term fix. The cancer cells recurred within 2 weeks of the test. SCP-294 initially just seemed like a boring magic vending machine, but it was only after the extensive experimentation that you just saw a shortened log of that the SCP Foundation was able to discern its true nature. It wasn't an unthinking object. It was sentient, intelligent, and even a little sarcastic, though none of that stopped it from doing its job, providing people with a hot cup of whatever they needed to drink. Just make sure you type in your request very carefully. What's the largest animal you can think of? Okay, that's probably too vague of a question. Your mind probably went straight to the oceans, picturing deep-sea leviathans like the mighty blue whale. Let's go a little bit closer, shall we? What about on land? What are the biggest animals that live up here with us above the water? Elephants, maybe? What about rhinos? Then again, hippos are up there too, in the same kind of ballpark, all pretty huge. What about cows? They can grow pretty big, right? Especially with all the crazy growth hormones that meat manufacturers pump into them these days. Well, what if there was something out there bigger than all of those? Imagine it. Some huge beast roaming the wilderness that easily towered above any creature you've ever seen in your life. This thing would be massive, striding across the world, towering above the meager height of a human being. Now, imagine that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't just big, but kept getting bigger. Sure, all of this might sound like the premise for the next Godzilla or Cloverfield movie, but while Big Charlie might not be the king of the monsters, it certainly lives up to that first part of its nickname. Of course, the SCP Foundation calls it SCP-4158. Big Charlie is just the playful nickname that the owners gave it, although none of them are sure who was the first to call the creature by that name. Standing on 4 long legs at 3.4 meters tall when the Foundation first discovered it, SCP-4158 was about 1 3/5 times as tall as famous professional basketball player Shaquille O'Neal. But since then, well, like we said, Big Charlie is getting bigger day by day. The creature appears to be tangentially related to the bovine family of mammals, essentially making it a ginormous cow. However, SCP-4158 lacks the facial structure and features that you might expect to see on the faces at your local farm. The creature has thin, translucent skin, which is so fragile that it often tears easily, and anyone observing SCP-4158 can often see the bones and internal organs within. Ugh, gross. It possesses a large bulbous head with a protrusion at the front almost like a beak. As well as that, its huge eyes are foggy, a milky white color which seems to suggest that SCP-4158 is, at least, partially blind. The large cattle-like mammal is incredibly skinny, almost to the point where its bones stick out from underneath its skin. Its legs are longer than the rest of its colossal body, and seem barely able to support the animal's weight. On description alone, you can't help but feel sorry for the poor creature and its sorry state of living. Normally, Big Charlie is mostly calm and docile, barely acknowledging the Foundation personnel that come to examine it, feed it, or clean its containment cell. Held in a heavy containment zone, SCP-4158 is fed through a 5-meter trough on the far east wall of its cell, surviving on a diet of raw beef, hay, wood, and bricks. Not the typical grass-only eating habits you'd expect from normal cows. But according to the Foundation's extensive testing on the creature, its diet doesn't seem to be what is causing SCP-4158 to keep growing at the rate it has been. The mass of Big Charlie is in some sort of state of perpetual increase, meaning its size and weight are always growing. And it is because of this continuous growth that every week the Foundation is forced to shear off great swaths of excess meat from the creature, cleaving off its flesh and incinerating the mass, all while Big Charlie is still alive. Now, before you start dialing PETA's hotline, it's also worth mentioning Big Charlie can't feel pain. What's more, testing has revealed that the meat taken from SCP-4158 is USDA utility-grade beef, the kind that would normally come from older cattle. Utility-grade meat has no fat marbling, so it isn't as tender or as flavorsome as other more premium grades, but would normally be used in canned and processed food products. And despite the Foundation destroying the excess that they cut off of Big Charlie as a precaution, in theory the meat is still good to eat and possesses no anomalous properties. Then again, would you really want to eat a burger made from SCP-4158? I didn't think so. If left unchecked and allowed to grow for longer than a week, SCP-4158 will begin to form new features, limbs, organs, and sometimes even genitals will sprout from random places all over its body. The previous record for Big Charlie's most substantial growth was when he increased to 8.5 meters tall. That's over 3/5 the height of the Hollywood sign and over 1.5 times the average height of a giraffe. At this immense size, Charlie has developed 7 legs, 4 stomachs, 3 tongues, and numerous other extremities before the SCP Foundation cut him back down to size. And we mean they literally cut him back down. So what exactly is this thing? It's like a giant cow, but not actually a cow, even though its flesh is identical to beef. And it's not a destructive, rampaging monster either, showing no hostility towards humans, even when they are shearing its excessive body mass away. Could it be some kind of failed genetic experiment? An attempt to solve hunger by engineering a creature that could not only stay alive, but keep growing after having its meat cut away? If that were true, it would make SCP-4158 a literal cash cow for the meat industry. Well, we've got kind of a funny story about that, actually. Big Charlie was first encountered by the Foundation back in December 2004 in Crewdson, Indiana. A number of calls had been made to the area's local animal control services, with reports of a large cow with mange roaming the nearby Highway 17. 2 officers belonging to the Animal Control Department were sent out to investigate these reports, and what they found was SCP-4158, wandering aimlessly, but unlike any cow they had ever seen. The officers called local police, where a Foundation plant caught wind of what they had found and called in containment specialists. The case was closed after the animal control officers were given amnestics, and a cover story was put in place about a cow with mange that was put down where it had been found. In reality, the SCP Foundation rounded up old Big Charlie and transported it to safety with little resistance from the animal. They were able to trace the creature's origin back to somewhere called Butcher's Block, a nearby slaughterhouse. The manager of the establishment, one Jeff Fine, and a single employee named Barney Mossman were brought in by the Foundation for questioning. Another employee, Rory Gildson, was also retrieved from his home after having called in sick to work that day. Barney Mossman, the first of the Butcher's Block employees to be interviewed, stated that SCP-4158 had been called Big Charlie since long before he had started his job at the slaughterhouse. According to his testimony, he knew nothing about where the creature had actually come from, only that it was fed hay, but would also occasionally eat anything else it could, including other cows. Since joining Butcher's Block 4 years earlier, Mossman had been told not to ask questions or to tell anyone else about SCP-4158. The morning after the huge creature had seemingly escaped, Mr. Fine had apparently angrily accused both Barney and Rory of selling him out and giving Big Charlie away to the competitors of Butcher's Block, even though they were the only slaughterhouse in the area. But Mossman was convinced that neither of them were capable of doing something like that. Rory apparently treated Big Charlie like his own child, and Fine had an even stranger relationship with the creature. Rory Gildson, the other of Fine's employees, was more helpful in shedding light on SCP-4158's origin than Barney had been. Rory explained that he and Jeff Fine had bought a pregnant cow from an unknown person 9 years earlier, considering it to be a steal, a 2 for the price of 1 bargain. However, one day without warning, the calf fell out of its mother. It wasn't born like any ordinary cow, however. According to Gildson, it had ripped through the mother cow's chest and looked disgusting. While Rory and Jeff had initially thought the calf to be dead, they discovered it had tried to get back into the barn after they hauled it outside. Their original intention had been to sell the creature off for scientific study, or failing that, to a freak show. However, after their attempts to sell the calf failed, Jeff and Rory had decided the best course of action would be to put the animal down. They had reasoned that releasing it into the wild could have negatively affected the ecosystem, so instead they took a bolt pistol and pushed it between the creature's eyes, then fired. But nothing happened. Rory tried again, but ended up breaking the gun instead. They slit the animal's throat, but it barely bled. Even butchering it on the spot while it was still alive did nothing. Fine and Gildson reduced the calf to little more than a skeleton, but it simply refused to die. The pair of them packaged the meat they had removed with the rest, hoping no one would notice or ask where it had come from. It was a few days later that Rory realized SCP-4158 was capable of regrowing whatever was cut off of it. He and his boss even tried some, and couldn't tell the difference. They had their hands on a cow that would eat anything put in front of it, and that could produce infinite meat. The Foundation probed Rory Gildson further for more information on the creature, learning that SCP-4158 was sterile and incapable of reproducing, the only one of its kind. Rory argued that the Foundation legally couldn't take Big Charlie away, that the creature was still private property. Little did he realize he was wrong. But he, just like Barney Mossman, also knew nothing about how the animal had escaped in the first place. Finally, Jeff Fine, the owner of the Butcher's Block slaughterhouse, was questioned by the Foundation. He repeated Rory's earlier story about the strange calf that had been born and how it could regenerate the flesh that was sheared off of it. Fine remarked that he considered it to be a blessing. When asked about his whereabouts on the night SCP-4158 had escaped from Butcher's Block, Jeff admitted that he had been praying, but not to God, to Big Charlie. He had apparently been doing this every night since realizing what the creature could do, viewing the animal as a provider and a savior. I just felt something when I was around him. I could tell that he wanted to make this sacrifice for us. Ever since he tried to get into the barn after we threw him out, I knew he cared for us, Fine told the Foundation. I would open his pen, take off my clothes so that I was pure before him, lay down and receive his blessings. And how would he receive those blessings? By drinking the animal's blood. Yeah, Jeff Fine was a real eccentric like that. One night, when Fine had entered the pen to perform this weird ritual, Big Charlie had escaped. But his owner was convinced that there must have been a reason for this, that the animal had some sort of goal. When the Foundation staff conducting Fine's interview dismissed this idea, the slaughterhouse owner became enraged.
How dare you question Big Charlie? He knows what's best for all of us. I'm done here. I don't need to keep answering questions like this. Let me out. I need to see Big Charlie. I need to see if he's safe.
The Foundation believes that Jeff Fine's practice of worshipping SCP-4158 was not due to any anomalous effect caused by the creature itself. None of the Foundation personnel tasked with feeding, studying, and shearing meat off of Big Charlie have displayed any similar behavior of performing abnormal religious rituals. He really was just a huge weirdo. As for the Butcher's Block slaughterhouse, Fine and the rest of his employees were given amnestics to forget Big Charlie had ever even existed, and the slaughterhouse was closed under the false pretense of a health code violation and its staff being arrested for malpractice. The one question that remains unanswered, however, is the identity of the individual that first sold Jeff Fine the cow that gave birth to SCP-4158. It just goes to show you, though, sometimes you don't know where your food is coming from. If you lived in Indiana in late 2004, who knows? You might have eaten some of Big Charlie and not even realized it. Did you ever have to perform a dissection in school? Maybe you had to carve up a fetal pig, or slice into a frog while nightmarish visions of Kermit and a widowed Miss Piggy danced in your head. Though it's rarely a pleasant experience, unless your tastes are on the morbid side. Most biology teachers would agree that the best way to learn how something works is to take it apart. As distasteful as it can be to hold a frog's tiny liver in your hands, it definitely does give you a better sense of the pieces that make up the complete creature. But what if there was an easier way to look at the individual parts of a living being? What if you could take it apart without ever having to prep a scalpel or stain your hands with the blood of innocent frogs? Like most of the seemingly impossible things in our world, the SCP Foundation discovered something that allows its users to do just that. In fact, it can handle a lot more than just a frog, and its applications go far beyond the confines of a high school science lab. SCP-291 is a small, plain steel building with a large door on one side. The door has no handle or knob and functions similarly to a garage door. The door cannot be pried open by any ordinary means, and the inside of SCP-291 can only be accessed if the structure is connected to a suitable power source. Once a power source has been connected, the door races and exposes a room inside. It is small, about 4 by 2 meters. It contains a console board, a large screen, and a plexiglass container resembling a coffin. How very sinister. The coffin is large enough to contain a human under 7 feet tall. So sorry, Ferdinand the Cannibal, you're going to need to sit this one out. The coffin sits on a conveyor belt with several tubes connected to the wall above it. On the opposite side of the room, there are holes of varying sizes, each containing a small door that can be opened or closed. Because initial observation indicated that SCP-001 was intended for some kind of human testing, a D-class test subject was selected for experimentation. The subject was instructed to lie down in the coffin and wait to see what would happen next. The display screen lit up, depicting a grid-lined image of the test subject. Buttons along the console board adjusted the image, showing the skin, muscles, and organ systems of the person in the coffin. There were no words or numbers on the screen, and all of the buttons appeared to have only 2 settings: on and off. When one of the researchers pressed the first button on the console, the tubes above the coffin began pouring a blue liquid into it. The test subject reacted with confusion, but did not experience any adverse effects. They quickly lost consciousness, indicating that the liquid was some sort of sedative. The liquid continued to pour into the coffin until the vessel was completely filled, at which point it congealed into a thick gel. The test subject's breathing and heartbeat slowed to a stop, and the conveyor belt suddenly creaked to life. The coffin was carried, test subject inside, through a small door that immediately locked behind it. The small room was filled with the sounds of gears turning, machinery clinking, and motors whirring. The display screen was taken over by a large rectangle, resembling a traditional loading screen. After 30 minutes, the process was complete, and the back door of the room unlocked itself. When the researcher walked through the back door, they found another room with a conveyor belt and a row of 24 lockers. Each locker was opened, one at a time, and its contents removed for examination. Inside each, the research team found a different portion of the test subject's body, in a block of some unidentified clear substance. The body was divided in the lockers into these separate parts: brain, lungs and diaphragm, heart, digestive system, reproductive organs, left eye, right eye, upper left torso and arm, upper right torso and arm, lower left torso and upper leg, lower right torso and upper leg, lower left leg and foot, lower right leg and foot, lower left arm and hand, lower right arm and hand, neck and head, upper skeletal system, lower skeletal system, lymphatic and circulatory system, and skin. Phew, the miracle of the human body, right? Boundless in its fascinating complexities. Each block of body parts was placed back in its designated locker, and the second button on the console was pressed. At this point, the doors to the organ lockers sealed themselves shut, and the sound of the machinery working filled the small space once again. This continued for a duration of approximately 45 minutes. When the machinery went silent, a new plexiglass coffin emerged into the main room, with the test subject inside. He looked identical to how he had looked at the start of the experiment, with no evidence that he had previously been disassembled. The blue liquid slowly evaporated from the container, and the test subject opened his eyes. The lead researcher conducted an immediate interview with the reassembled subject, who reported no memory of the process after initial exposure to the blue liquid. They insisted that the process had been like a good night's sleep, which honestly makes us pretty eager to take it for a spin. A medical examination determined that there were only a few changes to the test subject during the disassembly and reassembly. When they returned to consciousness, the test subject's stomach was empty, they were naked, and all of their hair was gone. With this new understanding of SCP-001's anomalous properties, the Foundation decided to continue their experimentation. With each new test, the experiments became more creative and, unsurprisingly, more depraved. First, a D-class subject was placed in the coffin and disassembled. Then, instead of placing the various body parts in their designated lockers, the vital organs were removed from their storage before reassembly was attempted. This resulted in the equipment shutting down completely. A researcher pressed the third button, which forced a hard reset of the entire process, causing all of the blocks of body parts to eject via an exit hatch. During the next experiment, non-vital organs were removed before the subject's body was reassembled. The appendix and gallbladder were left out, and when the subject regained consciousness, these organs were still gone. However, there was no visible damage or scar tissue in their place. They were simply gone, as if they have never been there in the first place. So, if body parts could be removed from a test subject, could new body parts be added? could existing body parts be replaced with different ones? A D-Class subject in need of a skin graft following a flamethrower-based accident was placed in SCP-001. Once taken apart, a portion of healthy skin donated by another, somewhat unwilling D-Class subject was placed in the locker, along with the skin already present there. Once the subject was put back together, the healthy skin had replaced the damaged skin with no adverse effects. Repeat attempts at this test showed that it was effective for limb transplants, heart transplants, and kidney transplants with a 0% failure rate across all tests. After determining that SCP-001 could be used for an untold amount of good, making organ donations easier and safer than ever, the Foundation naturally had to pivot to something more useless, but interesting and likely horrifying. After all, it's not like they could ever just make anomalous technology available to the public, right? 2 D-Class subjects, 1 man and 1 woman, were disassembled by SCP-001. The brains of the test subjects were swapped, and then they were reassembled. When they awoke, the subjects had the personalities and memories of the brain placed in their body. In a turn of events previously only seen in blockbuster comedies like Freaky Friday and the live-action Scooby-Doo movie, seminal piece of cinema, the subjects had swapped bodies. They were subsequently disassembled, their request to look at their new bodies naked having been swiftly denied, and the brains were returned to their rightful bodies. After the experiment was finished, the subjects appeared mostly normal. However, they did complain of disorientation as well as mental and physical discomfort over the next several days. After going through 2 brain transplants in 1 day, though, that's really the least you can expect. After perfecting the practice of swapping body parts between different human subjects, the ghoulishly curious research team decided to take things in an interspecies direction. A variety of test subjects, including cats, dogs, lizards, fish, mice, and, of course, humans, were selected for this next round of experiments. 20 tests were performed using these new subjects, and only 3 of the experiments were successful in transferring body parts from an animal of one species to another animal of a different one. Attempts to swap body parts between mammals and reptiles or fish proved disastrous. When a fish and a human were both disassembled and the fish's gills were placed with the human's body parts, neither creature survived the reassembly process. The human awoke with a new set of gills embedded in their neck and immediately began gasping for the oxygen they could not take in. Within minutes, they had suffocated. The fish's fate was even worse. It did not reassemble so much as it became a pile of goo, scales, and 2 floating eyeballs. Experimentation with a human and a lizard yielded similar results, turning the lizard into a puddle of organic matter and killing the human test subject after only a few minutes. As disastrous as the failed cross-species tests were, the successful ones were almost as bad. Trial 001 involved a cat and a human. Not wanting to attempt too much at once, the research team opted to just swap out 1 organ, the left eye. Both subjects survived the transfer and were able to use their new eye. The human subject reported full use of the cat's eye, with improved night vision in addition to trouble seeing color. The cat did not enjoy its new eye nearly as much as the human subject, and had clawed its human eye out of its head by the end of the following week. In Trial 007, a successful brain transfer was performed between an adult human man and an English Mastiff. The man in the Mastiff's body expressed discomfort with walking on all 4s and asked to be returned to his body as soon as possible. The Mastiff in the man's body adjusted to bipedal locomotion in a few hours, but was disassembled after urinating on a researcher's shoes. The final successful trial, and the most unnerving, was Trial 016. A female D-Class test subject's reproductive organs were swapped with those of a pregnant Labrador retriever. An ultrasound conducted after the transfer indicated that the Labrador fetuses survived the procedure and could conceivably be carried to term by the human subject. Several members of the research team began to take bets on whether or not she would end up giving birth to puppies, but the transfer was reversed within the day, so we'll never know what exactly would have happened. Perhaps that's for the best. Personally, we hope the Foundation's Ethics Committee gives some of these scientists a very stern talking to about their behavior on this one. When not in use for testing, SCP-001 is to be disconnected from any power sources. At least 2 personnel are positioned outside of its containment at all times, standing guard, and these personnel must be swapped out every week. When it is not connected to any power sources, SCP-001 is considered harmless, though it should still be treated with caution. The main entryway remains closed and locked when there is no available power source. but the door can be opened manually from the inside in the event of an emergency. Any disassembled organisms are stored in a locker in the containment facility, labeled with a Sharpie marker in order to keep track of what specimens are stored there. Whether this is the same Sharpie used to label food in the break room fridge is unknown, but just like Dr. DiRamiro's ham sandwich, it's best to leave these items untouched. Any personnel found to be responsible for missing specimens will be transferred to another project and receive a strongly worded email. Do you like scary movies? If you're a fan of horror, there have probably been quite a few times where you found yourself yelling at the movie screen, "Don't go up to the attic. Don't split up. Don't check out the noise in the basement. Run out the front door." You know the characters can't hear you, but when the story is engaging enough to make you care about their well-being, you can't help but try and give them a hand. After all, you'd want someone to save you from a machete-wielding maniac stalking through a summer camp you took up your new counselor job at. If someone was watching you hide in the closet, listening for a masked killer's footsteps with a kitchen knife in your hand, you'd want them to give you a heads up when the killer was getting ready to chop through the door with an axe. Of course, the characters in your favorite movies never listen, because, you know, that's how movies work. But in 1985, a young man returned a VHS tape entitled Return of the Suburb Slasher to his local video store with a peculiar complaint. The main character of the movie stopped mid-action to look at the camera and beg for his help. The video store clerk laughed him off and refused to give him a refund, though he did eventually give in and offer store credit after the man began to cry. He decided to take the tape home and watch it, just to see what all the fuss was about. After all, he'd never seen someone cry at a horror movie like that. So he sat down on his favorite beanbag chair, pushed the tape into the VCR, and pressed play. Apparently, his shell-shocked customer had at least remembered to be kind and rewind. The movie told the story of Heather Campbell, a young woman planning to host a party at her family's home in a classic suburban cul-de-sac, while her parents were out of town. In equally classic slasher fashion, this party would take place on the 10th anniversary of a series of grisly murders in the same neighborhood, committed by the mysterious Suburb Slasher. As the party kicks off with loud music, teenage debauchery, and lots of drinking out of red plastic cups, the killer appears to pick off the group of friends one by one. Like other classic slasher victims, your Michaels and your Jasons, the Suburb Slasher also covers their face, wearing a black burlap sack over their head that masks all identifiable features. The first 90 minutes of the movie were fun but basic. A canoodling couple gets decapitated here, an unnecessary shower scene is cut short by a stabbing there, the sort of thing you'd expect. But at about 97 minutes in, something impossible happened. Heather walked into the living room, finding her friend's dead body strewn across it, and let out a scream that measured up to the bests in the genre. The teen scream queen then began to run as the killer appeared to chase her. She made her way into the basement of the house, locked the door behind her, then she turned to the camera, tears in her eyes, shirt spattered with blood, and said, "Hey mister, I don't know you, and I don't know why you've just sat there watching this without doing nothing, but please, I'm begging you, help me out here. What can I do to survive this?" At first the clerk thought he was under the influence of some mind-altering substance, but the only things in his system were popcorn and store-brand soda. No, this was really happening. He stared open-mouthed at the screen, where Heather watched him expectantly. He was too stunned to speak. After a moment of silence, Heather sighed dejectedly, shaking her head, and turned back toward the stairs. She slowly walked back to the basement door, unlocked it, and pulled it open. There the killer was waiting with his expressionless burlap mask. The clerk's eyes widened and he cried out, "No!" But it was too late. The film suddenly cut to black, and with a whirring sound, the VCR spat the tape back out. The clerk sat there, staring at the tape. What could he do with it? Should he make a copy, send it to someone else, and pass the curse along? Should he try to watch it again? He wasn't sure he could bear to see Heather looking at him with those same pleading eyes. Then he remembered an ad he had seen in the back of his favorite comic book. Seen something you can't explain? A brush with the unknown keeping you up at night. We're looking for stories of the strange and unusual. Write to us now. Maybe they could do something he couldn't. He put the tape back into its cover, placed it in an envelope, and mailed it off the next day. A few days later, the package reached its intended recipient, an undercover branch of the SCP Foundation tracking anomalous activity via a series of ads in comic books and video stores to tap into one of the most underutilized resources in the world. Nerds. The tape was designated SCP-5733, and Heather and the mass killer were designated SCP-5733-2 and SCP-5733-1 respectively. After an initial viewing confirmed its anomalous properties, a research team headed by Dr. Carpenter began to perform a series of tests. Testing was open to all Foundation employees, subject to approval by Dr. Carpenter. Approved personnel would be placed in a Site-73 multi-purpose room with a VHS player and a television. The staff member would then watch the movie and attempt to engage with Heather and help her escape. For the first test, D-Class 1973 was selected. When Heather turned to the camera and asked for help, he asked if she had a car. When she confirmed that yes, she did, he instructed her to sneak back upstairs, find her car keys, leave through the back door, and drive as fast and as far away as possible. She successfully retrieved the car keys, but when she reached the car, she saw that the tires had been slashed. Heather began to panic, but 1973 talked her through it, telling her to smash the window of a neighbor's car and unlock the door. She complied, and 1973 instructed her on how to hotwire the vehicle. The car started, and with a triumphant laugh, she sped out of the cul-de-sac. Just as her car began to pull away, the killer emerged from the back seat, wielding a kitchen knife. Heather screamed, and the tape cut to black. For the next test, D-Class 1944 was selected. He began by telling Heather to find her father's shotgun, seen earlier in the film, and use it to take out the killer before they could get to her. She snuck up to her parents' room and found the gun, only for the killer to appear in the doorway behind her. She aimed the gun and fired, but nothing happened. The killer opened their hand, dropping the shotgun shells on the floor. She was close, but the killer was one step ahead. She screamed as they approached with the knife, and again, the tape cut to black. After several tests were conducted with D-Class subjects and no adverse effects were reported, aside from the obvious trauma of failing to save Heather's life, testing was opened up to all Foundation staff. Assistant researcher Felissa Baker volunteered. She believed her extensive knowledge of the slasher genre would give her the tools to help Heather strategize. After speaking with Heather about her skills, which mainly included party planning and babysitting, Felissa determined that Heather should seek outside help. With Felissa's help, Heather made her way out of the house and over to the home of her next-door neighbor, Mr. Loomis. When she got there, the door was open and the lights were off. It didn't look great, but she didn't really have much of a choice but to go inside. She made her way to the bedroom where Mr. Loomis and his wife were lying in bed. She tried to wake him, but the camera zoomed in to reveal his throat had been slashed. The shape in the bed next to him sat up and was not in fact his wife, but the Suburb slasher instead. As the figure raised their signature kitchen knife, the screen went to black. SCP-5733 became a competition of sorts among Foundation staff, each volunteer proposing their knowledge would help them get Heather to safety. Assistant researcher Nick Younglin-Doskowitz proposed telling Heather to call for help, giving her a secret phone number for the SCP Foundation circa 1983, the time in which the movie was set. However, when Heather reached the phone, it had been destroyed, smashed to pieces. Next to it was a note written in blood that said, "The only Foundation here is fear." Then the killer appeared behind Heather, and the tape went to black. Somehow the killer knew about the SCP Foundation. Perhaps in a manner of speaking, the call was coming from inside the house. Next, Field Agent Malcolm Pleasance and Donald McDowell were selected due to their extensive knowledge of hand-to-hand combat. They attempted to teach Heather various fighting and self-defense techniques, while she survived on the limited supplies available in the basement. She eventually left the basement and, when the killer appeared, began to fight them. After 23 minutes of combat, she knocked the slasher to the floor and grabbed the candlestick to finish them off. As the agents watching began to celebrate, a second version of the suburban slasher appeared behind her, lunging forward. Just before the new killer made contact, the tape cut to black. During this test, the slasher seemed more adept at combat than it had been before, as though it could hear the advice being given to Heather. With other techniques failing, Field Agent Tilda Joan Bennett was brought in for a test, selected due to her expertise in thaumaturgy. She instructed Heather on basic offensive and defensive thaumaturgy before guiding her out of the house and into the front yard. When the slasher appeared brandishing their knife, Heather was able to sign a protective glyph and defend against the knife's blow. She followed this with a wind spell that pushed the killer further away. Heather began to run down the driveway, making a break for survival, when the slasher suddenly performed a freeze spell that rendered her unable to move. Heather's wide, panicked eyes stared down the barrel of the camera in a silent scream as the killer approached her, recovered the knife in hand before the tape went to black. Eventually, Dr. Carper volunteered to conduct a test. He instructed his research team to prepare a list of options for Heather's survival, divided into 4 categories: what to take from the basement, where to go once leaving the basement, how to exit the house, and how to escape the cul-de-sac. He was not informed about any of these options, but rather had them printed out and placed into plastic bowls on the day of the test. There were also 3 cards created and placed face down, reading face, body, and legs. When Heather addressed Dr. Carpenter, he informed her that he would be randomly selecting instructions for her and asked that she follow them exactly. The first slip of paper instructed Heather to grab a pair of garden shears from the basement and climb the stairs back into the main house. Next, she was told to go upstairs to the bedroom, then downstairs into the dining room. She complied, and there was no sign of the killer so far. Third, Dr. Carpenter told Heather to run back upstairs, out of the bedroom window, onto the roof, and then jump down into the garden. Then it was time for the next step. He told Heather to jump over the fence into the neighbor's garden and run down the street until she could find help. As Heather made her way down the road, the slasher broke through the front door of her house, but did not chase after her. Heather continued running down the road for 20 minutes as the trees and lights began to dwindle. The surroundings began to grow darker and darker until they resembled a void. Dr. Carpenter instructed her to keep walking. She could make out lights and houses in the distance. She ran toward the neighborhood, but stopped suddenly and began to panic. She was back in her own neighborhood, in front of her own house, and the killer was waiting for her. As Heather demanded to know what to do, Carpenter flipped over one of the 3 cards. It read, face, and so he told Heather to attack the killer's face with the shears, then the killer's legs, then his body. The killer dodged her attack, grabbed the shears, and pushed her to the ground. As Heather looked up at the killer, his face could be seen through the torn sack. It was Dr. Carpenter. Heather screamed, and the tape cut to black. Talk about a third-act twist. The movie itself did not create the killer, but somehow the viewer did, and it also made the killer more creative. After this incident, all testing on SCP-5733 was suspended, and attempts to help turn Heather from victim to survivor were halted. Searching for answers, the Foundation looked into Crystal Elms Productions, the production company listed on the videotape's cover. No record of the production company, the film, or any of its cast could be found. Several months after testing on SCP-5733 was suspended, another tape was found. Because, let's face it baby, these days you've gotta have a sequel. The new tape was titled The Suburb Slasher Strikes Again, and was purported to be produced by Crystal Elms Productions in 1985. It was designated SCP-6733. Unlike its predecessor, this tape was only tested once. A member of D-Class personnel was first shown SCP-5733 up until the point where it becomes anomalous, and was then shown SCP-6733. He was left completely alone in order to watch the contents of the tape. The following was what was on it. Dr. Malcolm Baines entered the testing chamber to find D-1974, or Jamie, sitting across from the television set. He introduced himself and ran a series of cognitive tests. He asked Jamie what he thought of the film, and he said, it was pretty much your standard slasher film. There's a group of teens who just graduated high school and go to a local camping site by a lake to celebrate. One of them mentions it's near the site where the killer, the slasher, was shot dead by police a year prior after a rampage. Dr. Baines clarified, asking if this was a reference to the first film. Jamie continued, it's not really clear, they all think it's a joke, apart from the main girl. She said her dad's a police officer and she's seen video evidence of the attack. No one references any of the characters from the first film though, and they don't show up in this one either. The slasher's the only constant. According to Jamie, the main events of the film revolved around a lakeside camping trip and quickly began to go wrong. Dr. Baines inquired about the nature of the slasher's kills, and Jamie elaborated, he's still got a kitchen knife, same weapon as the first film, so he stabs a lot of them. It's pretty gory for the time it was made. He slashes up someone's face, then the nerdy guy gets stabbed through the eye. That one's pretty good. The camera gets sprayed with blood. One of the teens gets his head crushed wide open. Dr. Baines asked Jamie how the scenes made him feel, and he responded, there's some good jump scares and the tension's fairly high at points, but it's a little dated. I've seen scarier, but I've also seen worse horrors. Only one part of the film stood out to him. He described it. So,
The girl and her best friend, the one that's been looking out for her this whole time, enter into a cellar. The slasher creeps up from behind and grabs the friend, tears his head clean off his neck. The slasher then chases the other teen to the other side of the lake. He's advancing on her. The camera's set on the water of the lake. It's a wide shot. You've got the lake water line parallel to the top and bottom of the shot, so it splits the screen horizontally. She's fallen over, crawling away from him. As he advances on her, the camera zooms in. Slowly, though. It takes its time, and he does too. There's music at the start of the scene, like deep, dark synths. This stops as the camera moves closer, though. I forgot to say, it's a long scene, longer than 5 minutes. Maybe it was 10, I don't know, it felt longer than 10. So the slasher's approaching her. We're, the viewers, approaching the shore. And then the music stops, and it's just his footsteps and her pleading. And she's pleading, man. There's these big inhales of breath stifled by the mucus running out of her nose. She's babbling, but it gets to the point she's not even saying words, just making noise.
As Jamie continued, he began to grow increasingly distressed.
The camera's real close to the shore now, and the slasher stops. He turns his head and looks straight at the camera. You can't see his eyes, but you know he's looking straight at you. And he just stands there, staring. Eventually, the girl crawls out of the frame, or the camera zooms past her. I can't remember which. It just keeps zooming in on his face, where his face should be under the hood. The girl keeps screaming off camera, and then there's this guttural ripping noise, and the screaming stops. It just stops, but the camera keeps moving. You can see the individual droplets of blood splashed across him. You can see the fabrics that make up his hood. His face soon takes up the entire shot, and then black. No credits or nothing. The tape just cuts to black and was pushed out of the player.
Dr. Baines pushed a bit, asking if there was anything anomalous he could be forgetting. Then Jamie thought of something.
The girl, her friends, all of them, I don't think they had names.
Jamie became increasingly disturbed by the film over time, calling Dr. Baines into his dormitory to ask him if they had shown him a snuff film. After falling asleep, he had a vivid dream of the lake, crawling alongside it, recalling the deaths of his friends at the hand of a masked killer. When he woke up, he saw a shadow outside the window of his room. It stood there, silent and unmoving, all night. It only vanished when the sun came up. The next night, surveillance caught the image of a humanoid shape running through the forest, but the guards found no trace of it. Dr. Baines returned to Jamie's cell to find him deeply distressed. He repeated over and over that the slasher was coming for him. Dr. Baines dismissed this concern. Once Jamie was alone, he stared into the mirror as the temperature began to drop.
"You're here, aren't you?"
he said. A gloved hand punctured through the mirror, spraying glass everywhere. On the other side, there he was, the Suburb slasher. Jamie fled his dormitory and ran for his life as the slasher followed him. Security officer Lauren confronted the slasher, but they lifted him up by the neck and stabbed the familiar kitchen knife through his head. Jamie continued to make his way through the facility, the slasher following and leaving a trail of destruction and bodies in his wake. Then, he reached Dr. Baines, who was confused by his behavior. Dr. Baines insisted that he needed to get to the basement, but terrified, Jamie resisted him. The two men scuffled, and Jamie shoved Dr. Baines hard, sending him careening into the wall. A lighting rig fell from the ceiling, landing on Dr. Baines. Several strangers ran into the room, calling for a medic on set, and asking for production and lighting to come back and reset everything. Off-screen, a director yelled, "Cut!" The slasher's face appeared, taking up the entirety of the camera, and the tape cut to black. This version of the tape's events was created after the tape was watched by D-1888 in a testing session with Dr. Carpenter. There has never been a Dr. Baines in the SCP Foundation's employ. Somehow, this second tape creates a localized destabilization of reality. It is unknown how many times it has actually been tested. So be careful what horror rentals you decide to watch. You might just find yourself in the middle of the action, and no matter what you think you know about surviving a slasher film, there will be no escape. You can run, but you certainly can't hide.
Okay guys, so to wrap this video up, I really don't think this cursed episode of this show was real. It's obviously just a really good scary fan animation, and the fact that the creators behind it didn't come out and claim ownership of it sooner, allowing it to be reposted and re-uploaded so many times, is really what got people thinking it was legit. That being said, it's still a good attempt at what a cursed lost episode would look like, so shout out to those animators, man. Anyway, I've been the GOAT Hellholder98. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel down below, and hey, if you know about any more lost media you want me to cover, leave it in the comments and I'll check it out. Now be sure to follow my socials at Hellholder98. I go live most days and post updates about new videos on my story, so go check it out. Alright, until then, I'll see you somewhere down the line.
The moment his finger pushed the button to stop the camera recording, the practiced false smile dropped from Holden's face. It was hard not to feel down after he'd finished filming a new video, not thanks to any post-creativity slump, but the more depressing knowledge of just how much of an uphill battle this whole thing was. It felt like yesterday when Holden had first gotten into the creepier side of the internet. He never ventured into anything illicit or outright illegal, mind you, but there was a distinct corner of the web that had pulled him in when he was still at school and just starting to spend more time online. This part of the internet was filled with scary stories that were mostly fake or made up for likes, but that could have been real. There were unsettling animations, short clips that were hand-drawn to give people the creeps and keep them up at night. Not to mention a whole archive of public safety announcement videos, terrifying workplace and road safety warnings that used to be broadcast on TV and were as petrifying than the most acclaimed horror movies. Speaking of things that were broadcast to TV, that had gradually become Holden's specialty. One of his friends had sent him the link to a fictional account of someone who had supposedly uncovered an unaired episode of a Saturday morning kids cartoon, or so this person claimed anyway. They went on to describe bizarre imagery, so intense and terrifying that it was unbefitting of a show for children. Then, the person who made the original post explained how they got into contact with the show's creators via email to ask them about this cursed episode. The showrunner responded stating that the episode the poster had allegedly seen didn't even exist. To Holden, it didn't matter if the story was real or not. That wasn't the point. What was far more important was that it felt real. To him, it was plausible, even possible, that there were pieces of media out there in the world that had never seen the light of day. Episodes of TV shows or entire movies that were so wild and out there that they could have been banned and buried long before the dawn of the internet, wherein there was a record of everything and nothing was ever really lost. The idea of uncovering those lost pieces of media became Holden's primary hobby. He'd come home from school, throw his backpack onto his bed, and then sit in front of his computer for hours without even changing out of the clothes he had been wearing all day in class. But all the time he spent trawling through forum threads, following and messaging collectors on social media, listening to theories and coming up with his own. Eventually, it began to encroach on other things. Much to his mom's disappointment, Holden's grades took a rapid decline, and it wasn't long before he was failing his classes bad enough to not make the cut to continue on at school. But as much as it upset his mother, Holden really didn't mind. He was already thinking way beyond high school, and he knew he didn't need grades to be able to do the one thing he wanted to do with his life. Holden set up his own channel, with the plan to start uploading videos under his new online alter ego, and before long, Hellholder98 was born. He centered his whole internet persona around lost media, discussing which popular rumors were true and which were fictionalized for likes and clicks. It started out with a few discussion videos, where he would simply sit in his bedroom, a camcorder opposite him as he spoke. But before long, Holden was adding more and more flair to his content, learning how to edit on his computer, adding clips or screenshots he could find of supposed lost TV episodes to give his videos some credibility, a very necessary quality when trying to determine if certain things were real or not. Each video he finished, he had another 2 topics to a list of ideas he kept, planning to just perpetually churn out content until he eventually had a huge hit that went viral. Although the one thing he didn't realize until it was perhaps too late was that social media success didn't happen overnight. In fact, it didn't happen over many nights either. No matter how often Holden promoted his channel on his social media profiles, or how many new videos he uploaded, he couldn't seem to get any to land well and get boosted by the algorithm. At least that's one of the things he attributed the problem to. He pointed the finger of blame at anything that he could. One day, it was that the algorithm was suppressing his channel and boosting others who had already got more subscribers. The next, it might be his slow internet connection had led to one of his videos going live at a time when the site had low traffic. The one possibility that Holden didn't stop to consider was that maybe his genre of content was too niche, but that the days of the internet's interest in lost media had already peaked back when he was still in high school. Nevertheless, he kept trying, making content day in and day out, working under the assumption that if he just made enough videos, then one day he was sure to blow up. That would be his big break, his ultimate win, a video that did well enough to garner thousands, if not millions, of views. But the more time he devoted to Hellholder 98, the only number that seemed to be at all increasing was the number of videos he had posted, each one barely garnering view figures that were above a single digit. To make matters worse, getting help with growing his online brand was next to impossible. Every now and then he would post on forums asking for advice, or if anyone wanted to collaborate so he could gain some exposure from creators with bigger followings. Those posts were often met with a slew of apathetic, snide responses, or comments telling Holden to just, quote, make better content, as if that was solid, specific advice. On top of that, his mom had outright refused to support her son's chosen career path, citing his failure at school as the main reason. Speaking of, any friends Holden previously had at school had all moved away in the years since, going off to pursue college and other higher education. Some were even starting their new and exciting professions. The old saying said, it's lonely at the top, but Holden was just as lonely down at the bottom, posting his content in total obscurity, as if he was just shouting into an empty void, with no one around to hear. The few people Holden did still consider his friends were all as chronically online as he was, most of them fellow lost media collectors. After interacting with them in the comment threads of various forums, the handful of like-minded guys were as close as Holden had to people actively supporting his channel. The collectors would usually give him pointers or topics to discuss in videos and contributing to the single-digit view count underneath his uploads. Although to him, it wasn't nearly enough. He didn't want just his friends to see his videos. He wanted an audience, a fan base of his own. It was late, the light of the computer monitor illuminating the dark of Holden's bedroom. Hunched over his desk, he was clicking and dragging clips into the timeline of a video project, trimming them down to make the whole thing better paced, snipping out bad takes where he stumbled over his words or misspoke. It was while editing that Holden noticed another screen lighting up on his desk, accompanied by a vibration, his phone. He reached for it, seeing a notification popped up on the lock screen. It was from Goth, one of the lost media collectors, and it read, "Dude, urgent, found something that you can make a video on." Holden sighed. It was late, and he was already focused on editing this current video tonight. If he got it finished, then he could go to sleep. "What do you know about the deathly videotape?" Goth asked in a second message, before Holden even had a chance to open it first. "The what?" he replied bluntly, before sending another text saying, "Can't this wait until the morning? I'm trying to edit." "If you don't act fast, it'll be gone forever," came the response only a second later, followed by a link. Lethargically, Holden tapped the hyperlink Goth had sent, his phone opening up its browser and displaying the web page. It was a buy and sell website, one of those places where people offloaded junk they didn't want anymore to strangers for a bit of extra cash. The page in question showed a few grainy photos taken on a phone of a small rectangular object in someone's hand. "What is that?" Holden asked. "It's a videotape, bonehead," Goth fired back. Although they'd never met in person, Holden always got the sense his friend was a little older than he was. Looking back on the seller's ad, it was for a second-hand Sony Color Collection 60 to 90-minute mini DV videotape, a type of cassette used in a lot of old handheld recording cameras. "So what?" Holden asked in another text. "Look, there have been rumors for ages about something called the deathly videotape," Goth replied in a series of rapid-fire messages. "It used to be all the rage on a lot of old lost media forums, the real nasty ones before they got shut down. Supposedly, there's a recording on this tape of some kind of live show, except when you put it in your VCR and press play, you see something horrible. Nobody even knows if it's real or just a legend." "How do you know this is the same tape?" Holden queried. By now, he had typed out the same link on his computer and was looking at the for sale page on the bigger screen while he texted back and forth with Goth. "Read the item description," he answered. Holden's eyes scanned down the page, finding a short message from the seller. "To anyone interested, I'm giving this old mini DV tape away. I don't know where I got it or why I watched it, but I wish I hadn't. It had ruined everything for me. It's impossible to enjoy anything else now that I've seen what's on it. Let me make this clear, I am not selling this tape, I'm giving it away free of charge. I hope that getting rid of it will help." "Sounds ominous," Holden texted. "If you're so sure if this is the deathly videotape, then why don't you get it?" "Keep reading," Goth responded. Underneath the item description was another note that the seller had written. "Please note, I am unable to leave my town at present, nor can I mail this tape to anyone even if you pay postage. Collection only. If you're interested, please contact me at the following address. Below was an address. It was in Holden's hometown, only a few streets away from where he and his mom lived. This could be it, dude. Came another slew of messages from Goth. You buy this tape and make a video recording, then you might finally go viral. But you better be quick before someone goes and picks it up thinking it's just an ordinary tape. Holden looks back at the address, double-checking where it was. At most, it'd take a quick walk there and back, he thought. And if this tape was as elusive as Goth said it was, then owning it would mean Holden would be the only one who could make a video featuring it. After messaging the seller the night before, Holden found himself rushing through his quiet neighborhood to the address. All night as he tried to sleep, he kept thinking of the video he was going to make, how it could finally put him on the map, and at long last, bring him the E-fame he'd been working towards. Rapping his knuckles against the front door, he was met by an older man who stood on the other side. He was walking with a crutch, with a few bruises and stitched-up cuts on his face. The second that Holden explained he was there for the tape, the man reached to an unseen shelf just inside the doorframe and thrust the rectangular cassette into his hands before shutting the door as quickly as he could without it hitting Holden square in the face. He stared at the tape in his hands, though through its transparent green plastic case, he could see a hand-scrawled note. "I know you'll ignore me if I tell you not to watch this," it read. "So if you do, then on your own head be it." Having spent the rest of the day looking up exactly what he'd need to play such an old, outmoded recording format and convert the footage to digital so he could include it in his video, Holden had retrieved his mom's old VHS player from the attic, wiping the thick layer of dust off of it. It took a while for him to get everything ready to go, not just finding the right adapters and cables to hook the VCR up to his TV, as well as linking that to his computer, plus angling his camera right, and making sure the ring light he'd bought for filming was putting enough focus on his face. After the substantial prep, Holden took a deep breath, summoning up the faux excitement and stage smile before he hit the record button on his camera.
What's up, guys? It's Hellholder98 here. Now today I've got a real treat for you all. So my friend Goth, shout out to him, told me that a while ago there was talk about something called the Deathly Videotape. We found a mini DV tape that we think might be that very same tape, so we're gonna watch it and see if it's legit. Dropping his persona as his face turned away from the camera, Holden punched the play button on the VHS player, his eyes glued to the TV screen as the camera's lens was fixated on him. "Okay, nothing so far," he observed, met with nothing but a blank, black screen. Suddenly, after 12 seconds of nothing, the playback started instantly, and Holden started relaying what he was seeing on the tape to the camera. There was no sound, either because the recording on the videotape was filmed in that way or Holden hadn't properly figured out how to hook it up to the VHS. The video itself showed a recording of Sesame Street live, and for the most part just seemed pretty underwhelming. Characters were up on stage, their puppeteers managing to stay out of sight as they entertained their young audience. After 2.5 minutes, Holden was starting to feel like he'd gone to all this effort over what seemed to just be someone's old, unwanted home video. Just as he was considering turning off the camera and throwing the videotape in the trash, at almost the 3-minute mark, something weird started happening on the stage. The actor playing one of the bigger characters seemed to be having some trouble, instantly trying to pull off his cumbersome costume, much to the distress of the kids in the audience looking on in horror. But it wasn't just the illusion that had been broken. The actor was trying to get out of his costume because he was choking. He dropped to his knees on stage, clawing at his own throat before finally falling face down, totally still, asphyxiated, dead. Over the next almost 20 seconds, the same thing started happening to another 3 of the characters on stage, all of them violently choking while the children in the audience screamed and cried silently on the inaudible tape. Then at 3.5 minutes, the video cut out. Holden was unsure how to react, at first a little creeped out, only to be somewhat bemused. He played it down for the camera, remarking that the video seemed tame compared to some of the more graphic fake content he'd seen. But the whole time, even after wrapping recording, sitting awake all night to edit his reaction video, blurring out the parts that would break the terms of service, he had no idea what he'd seen was actually real or not. Finishing the final edit just as the sun was coming up, Holden hit upload and crawled into bed while his video was uploaded. The buzz of a text message from Goth awoke him. "Dude, I told you this video was going to make it big." Without even replying, Holden booted up his computer and opened the page for his newly uploaded video. The view count was already in the thousands and climbing, comments pouring in underneath, mostly from people debating whether or not the contents of the tape had been faked. Holden punched the air in excitement.
He'd finally done it. But as the video kept playing, he heard a retching sound coming from the computer's speakers. He turned to look back at his earlier self, filmed only the night before. Except what he was seeing play out on screen now wasn't what he remembered happening last night. It couldn't have, because the Holden in that video was choking. That wasn't possible. He was alive and watching his own video right now, but somehow the footage was shown him dying, his airway blocked, face turning red, then blue as tears streamed down his cheeks. In the video, Hellholder 98 fell down, dead from asphyxiation, and watching it made Holden feel sick. To make matters worse, none of the comments under the video seemed to have witnessed the same ending. Holden even texted Goth to ask if the same thing had happened, but he described the ending exactly as Holden remembered filming it. But afterwards, it didn't stop happening. Everything he watched ended the same. Every clip online, every TV show, every movie. Holden couldn't even read a book without some characters, fictional or otherwise, keeling over and choking to death, just like the characters on the tape. He barely had time to acknowledge the hits his reaction to the deathly videotape were getting. He was too busy trying to figure out why he couldn't stop seeing people dying the exact same way, even himself when he watched back his old Hellholder 98 videos. Reacting to the deathly videotape garnered a respectable 3 million views, but Hellholder 98 never uploaded again afterwards. His channel went silent, remembered only as a one-hit wonder until the video and the entire channel were taken down. Holden was never reported missing. The Foundation made sure of that when they came by to collect SCP-583 and place the videotape into containment.
We've covered a lot of SCPs on this channel, but trust us, none of them have quite the bite that this one does. We know you like the more intellectual anomalies, and this will give you plenty to chew on in that regard. While the SCP Foundation wants to keep SCP-5940 a secret, here at SCP Explained, we're gonna give you the tooth, the whole tooth, and nothing but the tooth. Truth. I meant truth. This SCP, thankfully, isn't as existentially threatening as a lot of the other ones we cover, but just because it won't send you on an express trip to the pearly gates doesn't mean it won't wreak havoc on your pearly whites. Open wide and say ah, because today we're getting into an anomaly that affects each and every one of us. Tell us, have you ever felt anxious about your teeth? Ever had that weird dream where all your teeth fall out, or even worse, someone pulls them out? Does the thought of us taking a hammer to your teeth, or them rotting away someday and making you need dentures, make you shudder and cringe? Don't be ashamed. The answer to this question for most people would be a resounding yes. And that's because of humanity's shared psychodental trauma. Don't know what that is? Well, that's fine too. After all, the Foundation has taken pains to hide all of this from you, for fear that even knowing about it might incur further psychodental stress. It's that kind of subtle but constant creeping dread you experience in a dentist's waiting room, knowing it's been too long since the last time you came in, and now you're fully anticipating him saying something like, "Wow, it's a real mess in here. I'm afraid we're gonna have to take them all, and I'm gonna charge you double just because they look so unpleasant." If that feels grimly familiar to you, then you know exactly what we're talking about today. The SCP Foundation searched long and hard to find the source of this peculiar collective trauma, which, ironically, is a major factor in people not actually visiting the dentist more often, and has found the source in question to be as ancient as it is strange. To best explain exactly what we're dealing with here, we need to take a trip to the North Pole, though sorry to tell you that today's SCP is not, in fact, Santa's workshop. It's actually the northernmost point of inaccessibility, a part of the world that's nearly impossible to reach, simply by virtue of being the cluster of Arctic ice pack furthest away from any landmass, always moving and shifting. But if through some means you were ever able to make your way up there, you would find an impossibly large pair of maxillary incisors, which in layman's terms is a giant pair of front teeth. So while there may not be Santa's grotto up there, if all you want for Christmas is your 2 front teeth, then buddy, you're in luck. Incidentally, these 2 giant teeth embedded into the ground and dubbed SCP-5940 by the SCP Foundation are connected to the 2 front teeth of every human being on Earth. Think of it as almost a pair of giant voodoo dolls, but their effects on each individual human are relatively mild. That's because the effects are actually distributed across all humans, and the more humans there are, the less damage to the enormous pair of teeth will affect each of us. The problem is humans have 8 incisors. They're the 2 sets of 4 front teeth on the upper and lower jaw, and this pair of teeth covers only 2 of them.
What about the rest? Well, next on our roster is SCP-5940-2. Let's join intrepid scientist and explorer Dr. John E. Namel, who has no affiliation with the SCP Foundation, on his quest to find them. Dr. Namel and his small team brave brutal colds and obscene treks through ice and snow to finally discover this grand creation near the southern pole of inaccessibility, the point of Antarctica furthest away from the Southern Ocean. When he and his men finally arrived, they gazed upon the incredible pair of teeth in awe, a mighty set of mandibular central incisors, otherwise known as the front teeth on the bottom jaw. The Foundation believes that the only way to truly solve the problems that SCP-5940 poses is to remove the various teeth from the areas where they're currently lodged. However, the Foundation doesn't yet possess the technology or resources to properly dislodge any of these behemoths. However, the psychic anticipation of the impending tooth removal has caused the psychodental trauma of people all over the world to skyrocket in the meantime. In a sense, it's like the entire world is sitting outside the dentist's office, waiting for a prognosis and hoping that when the dentist pulls out their pair of surgical pliers, they at least have the decency to give us a hit of the laughing gas first. However, the Foundation has discovered an interesting fact in the meantime. The effects of the teeth on the global population can be slightly mitigated by enacting certain forms of concussive trauma on them. And to perform this act for the greater good of the Earth's psychodental condition, Dr. John E. Namel and those accompanying him made the ultimate sacrifice. Knowing on a subconscious level what they must do, they began to turn their equipment into a kind of makeshift diving board above the giant incisors. Once the board was complete, the adventurers each took turns jumping off of it, gaining speed as they rocketed down towards the teeth below. As each of them hit the sharp upper edges of the teeth, they were cut in half, leaving a smear of red against the shining white calcium. The two halves of their bisected bodies fell down into the piles of frozen bones on either side of the teeth's base, all that remained of prior brave heroes who'd made their final pilgrimage to the site of SCP-5940. While none of these various expeditions were in any way officially related to the SCP Foundation, the Foundation nonetheless extended honorary Foundation stats of merit to those who decided to take the plunge for the collective psychodental health of their fellow man. For SCP-5940-3, we have to go deeper. Literally, it's at the bottom of the ocean. Namely, it sits below Point Nemo, also known as the oceanic point of inaccessibility, the furthest point away from land in the entire world's oceans. This next absurd pair of teeth, some mandibular lateral incisors, lurk below the churning ocean waves like well, there's nothing really like a giant pair of underwater teeth, is there? Thankfully, the position of these teeth have been serendipitous. Not only does their remoteness make them much harder for civilians to just stumble upon, but Point Nemo has always been a popular spacecraft graveyard. This means that during tests and sometimes even actual missions, the return trips are often piloted towards Point Nemo to prevent the risk of any errant spacecraft pieces from landing in populated areas and causing damage or death. Remember we mentioned earlier that the Foundation encourages repeated concussive attacks against the teeth to ward off their psychodental effects? Here, the pieces of spacecraft blasting into the water towards them fulfill that role. At the latest measurement, 126 of the 263 spacecraft ditched at this pole since 1971 had successfully collided with this particular pair of teeth, giving them perhaps the weakest output of psychodental trauma of any of the SCP-5940 instances. And while the furthest point in the ocean from any major land masses may seem about as remote as it gets, the last instance of SCP-5940 easily blows it out of the water. Well, not literally, but if it did, that would be a wonderful example of a problem taking care of itself, wouldn't it? The last instance of SCP-5940, SCP-5940-4, a pair of maxillary lateral incisors, live on the dark side of the moon. Yep, dentists and Pink Floyd fans of the world rejoice. You're probably wondering, while the first 3 pairs of teeth clearly grew on Earth, why is the 4th a pair of more lunar incisors? Studies performed by the Foundation on the soil around the base of the 4th set of teeth prove that they actually did originate on Earth. They believe to have split from Earth during the incident which formed the moon. This means that these teeth are literally older than the moon, and this also makes them billions of years older than humanity. So these giant teeth don't look like our incisors. Our incisors look like these giant teeth. So now we finally understand this ridiculous threat to our collective psychodental health. Move over, SCP-682, and step aside, Devourer of Worlds. Get the hell out of my face, Scarlet King. We can't deal with any of you small-timers until we solve the global psychodental health crisis posed by SCP-5940. Which elite heavy hitters have the Foundation put on the case to deal with these enamel nightmares? Meet the Department of Psychodentistry, a joint venture formed from the collaboration of the Psionics Division, a task force that specializes in psyche SCPs, the Department of Memetics, and most importantly of all, the Dentistry Division. You may be thinking, why does the SCP Foundation even need a Dentistry Division? That seems like a waste of time and resources. And if you're thinking that, you're not only wrong, you probably have horrible teeth. The Dentistry Division is the first and last line of defense that the Foundation has against a plethora of toothy anomalies, like SCP-5852, a strange phenomenon that causes human teeth to grow out of the bodies of cicadas, or SCP-2450, a condition that causes hyperdontia, the excessive development of teeth all over the bodies of mammalian creatures, with the infection being spread, appropriately, through bites. And, of course, SCP-478, a predatory moth-like creature that enters the bodies of victims under the age of 25 and attaches itself to the soft palate in the upper nasal cavity. From there, it would promote the unchecked growth of teeth on the soft palate of the victim, but that's just where it starts. Teeth develop all throughout the mouth, nasal cavity, esophagus, and even the interior of the stomach, where the digestion of the teeth leads to excruciating pain. Next time your entire body is filling up with teeth due to SCP-478, you'll really regret underestimating the value of the humble Dentistry Division. So, what does the new Department of Psychodentistry propose to do with SCP-5940, the ultimate in tooth-based anomalies? Thankfully, they have a plan that will unfold over the next 79 years, known as the Absolute Tooth Field, in all uppercase letters. It's a three-pronged plan that's sure to fully neutralize this dental menace. You see, there's one thing we haven't told you. The psionic relationship between SCP-5940 and the incisors of all of humanity isn't one way. While the giant teeth and what happens to them can affect our teeth, what happens to our teeth can also affect the nature of SCP-5940. And that little fact is the key to the Absolute Tooth Field plan. The first part of the plan involves using memetics to make humans shun birth control globally, accelerating population growth to 4.2% per year for the next 79 years. This will lead to a population of 200 billion humans by the year 2100. The second part will be using memetics to encourage every human to somehow mechanically remove all of their incisors. And the third part will be the most complicated of all, trying to get all these 200 billion humans to remove the same incisors at the same time. The Department of Psychodentistry estimates that this will create the sufficient psychic force to finally pull the various SCP-5940 instances from their moorings, and thus healing humanity's collective psychodental trauma. It is a brilliant plan to take out a dangerous anomaly, and surely 1,600 billion human incisors is a small price to pay.
In the summer of 2007, in the heart of a forest in Northern California, hundreds of people were gathered for a yearly art and music festival. It was meant to be a celebration, a weekend filled with creative expression, dancing, and sure, probably some illegal substances. But it was all said to be a mostly wholesome affair, and one that attendees had been looking forward to all year. On the evening of the festival's first night, after a day of painting, performance art, interpretive dance, and folk pop fusion, the organizers put together a massive bonfire. Everyone gathered around, roasting marshmallows and vegan hot dogs, and breaking out their acoustic guitars for a sing-along. It was all going well, and they were heading into the third refrain of Kumbaya, when a group of friends adding logs to the fire noticed something odd. Some of the flames at the edge of the fire pit were moving in a different direction than the rest. While most of the flames flickered upward, some tilting slightly with the direction of the wind, these flames were moving sideways against the wind, stretching themselves out towards the grass. It seemed bizarre, impossible, and they wondered at first if perhaps the brownies they had eaten earlier had more than just chocolate in them. But then, the flames kept moving, taking on a familiar shape. They were dancing orange and yellow flames, there was no doubt about that, but they also seemed almost like fingers. The fingers extended outward, grasping for something. Attached to the fingers was a hand, then an arm. Another hand joined it, twisting into the grass, which dried and crackled at its touch. One of the friends, a young woman named Flower, attempted to alert one of the event staff, but they were too busy trying to get their marshmallow to the perfect shade of golden brown. Unable to get any help, she watched helplessly as the fiery hands dragged a head, a torso, and the rest of a humanoid body behind them. It looked like the shape of an ordinary man, with the glaring exception that it was made entirely out of fire. It stepped out of the fire pit and began to take slow, halting strides toward the gathered crowd. Now everyone took notice of what was happening. First, they froze in shock, staring at this being of pure flame, unbearable heat radiating off of him as he moved closer and closer. When he reached out a hand toward Flower, and the arm of Flower's dress ignited in flames on contact, the first scream broke through the silence. When they marketed this year's event as Burning Man in the Woods, this was not what they had in mind. But there he was, just the same. A man made of flames tearing through what was meant to be a peaceful and happy event with no dangers beyond exhaustion, dehydration, and maybe a noise complaint or two. Instead, the crowd scattered in every possible direction, running for their lives. It was already too late for poor Flower, who fell to the ground shrieking in agony as the fire engulfed the organic material of her dress, and the flaming man pulled her into its deadly arms. Her screams went quiet, drowned out by the crackling roar of the fire as it fed on her flammable body. Once Flower was nothing but a pile of bones and ashes, the entity began to walk slowly, purposefully, through the woods with its arms outstretched. It brushed its fingertips over everything it passed, every tree, every stump, every plant or scrap of fabric torn off of a branch. The fire began to spread like, well, wildfire. By the time the first festival goers made it out of the forest and into the nearby town to get help, dozens of acres of forest were ablaze and over 50 people were dead. The fire department was deployed to the forest, where they were able to contain the blaze after hours of work. Meanwhile, word of the man made of fire that destroyed the art and music festival reached the only people qualified to deal with such a creature, the SCP Foundation. They deployed operatives embedded in the local police force, who joined the fire department under the guise of providing reinforcements. Once the blaze was contained and the area was largely safe to enter, they followed the path of the fire and tracked the being responsible for all of the destruction. They found it, shrunk to the size of a small child, huddled in the fire pit where it all began, as if it was hiding from the fire hoses. Then they apprehended the being, later designated SCP-457. SCP-457 is comprised of unknown materials, though obviously it is made up of something flammable. Whatever it is made up of something invisible and impossible to detect by any known scientific means. The only visible aspect of the entity is the flames it produces, which tend to make up a humanoid shape as long as it has enough fuel to reach that size. If it does not have enough fuel, it shrinks in size, becoming as small as the single flame atop a lit match. In its smallest form, it is indistinguishable from any other small flame, except for the occasional display of independence, such as jumping to other fires or flammable materials, which it can then use to grow larger. When it is large enough to take on a human form, SCP-457 displays human-like intelligence and is capable of communication through writing, which it does by burning letters into surfaces with its flames, or even through speech. Though it lacks the anatomy to produce a traditional voice, it produces coherent sounds via pressurized, superheated air, as well as the crackle of its flames. If provided with enough fuel to grow beyond humanoid size, the entity can split into 2 or more beings, depending on how much fuel it is given. However, this split state does not last, as the separate instances of SCP-457 will attempt to attack each other until they are the only one left standing. SCP-457 seems to want nothing more than to consume more and more fuel and spread as far as it can. It has shown a troubling ability to learn and adapt, purposefully breaking and interfering with sprinkler systems in the building and setting up elaborate traps for personnel it does not like. Dr. Smythe, head of the research team assigned to SCP-457, conducted an interview with the subject on a rare day where it was feeling cooperative in order to better assess its psychology and motivations. Dr. Smythe entered SCP-457's containment chamber, carrying a fire extinguisher in case of any hostility on the part of the entity. He stood on the other side of the blast-shielded window for extra protection. It crackled pleasantly in the corner, seeming to welcome him inside. He asked if it was capable of or willing to speak. It answered yes. He asked how it felt about being confined. It responded plainly, dislike, no fuel, no air. When Dr. Smythe reminded the entity that it had enough air and fuel to survive, it argued that it could not burn and had no fuel. To clarify, Dr. Smythe asked, "Are you saying that you cannot grow?" At this question, SCP-457 moved back and forth through the small section of the room, as if pacing and looking for something. It said, "Grow, need, must grow," and when asked how it felt, it simply said, "Hungry." As the questioning continued, the entity approached the window and stretched a hand made of flame toward the glass. For a moment, it stopped responding to Dr. Smythe. In order to get the being's attention back, he casually brought up the subject of water. At the very mention of it, SCP-457 let out a high-pitched scream and pressed itself against the window in a threatening gesture. Dr. Smythe warned it that it must move away from the window or it would be doused in water. It moved back, but screamed and hissed for several more minutes, offended and upset. SCP-457 resumed its pacing at a more aggressive speed and intensity. All the while it repeated, "Want fuel, want air, want burn, want to burn," again and again, getting louder and louder as it moved. Dr. Smythe was perplexed by this behavior, noting that there was no way out and wondering what it could be trying to accomplish. At this point, the interview took a turn for the disastrous. Somehow, SCP-457 was able to damage the sprinkler system and a section of the fuel injector that had been providing it with a small stream of fuel. With the nozzle broken open, several gallons of gasoline came flooding out, allowing the entity to grow to an incredible size in a sudden, massive, destructive blast. Exploiting a weakness in the blast shielding, SCP-457 was able to escape its containment for several minutes, burning its way down the hall of the facility until the larger sprinkler system activated, sending it hissing back to its cell. There it was apprehended by a team of guards and herded into a new, higher security cell. It is unknown how exactly the entity became aware of the weaknesses in its containment chamber, but this incident revealed that it is a highly intelligent being capable of problem solving. However, it learned this information and figured out how to exploit it. The Foundation realized that more extensive measures would need to be taken to keep it locked down and keep the general population safe. Due to the dangerous nature of SCP-457's corporeal form, highly specialized containment procedures have been put in place to keep the flame from spreading. The entity is kept in a 5x5 meter chamber with at least 9 inches of fireproofing in place, including asbestos and perlite. The observation window is blastproof and resistant to extremely high temperatures. The room's opening is made up of temperature-controlled and airtight chambers that can be sealed in the event of an escape attempt. The room itself is kept at a high humidity level, and a drain has been installed on the floor, with a sprinkler system in the ceiling and emergency hoses that can be operated if additional water is needed. A small portion of the room is free from water, but only enough so that SCP-457 can maintain its shape and protect itself from moisture. Any personnel that enters SCP-457's containment unit must wear Class A temperature-controlled and flame-resistant suits, and must enter in groups of 3. 2 of the 3 members of each group must be armed with blast shields and fire extinguishers. Personnel are not permitted to enter the containment chamber for any reason other than providing daily fuel, or fixing any issues with the room or its sprinkler system. In some ways, its containment procedures are reminiscent of a particularly spicy variant of SCP-173. If the entity attempts to attack any personnel, it can be deterred via the application of fire extinguishers or hoses until it backs down. If it escapes from containment, further sprinkler systems will be activated throughout the facility in order to contain the fire. The highest priority, aside from keeping the entity contained, is keeping it fed. Because it needs constant fuel in order to survive, the Foundation is currently prioritizing finding an infinitely renewable source of fuel. Though many have been proposed, including the use of other SCPs such as SCP-2689 and SCP-124, no source has been officially approved yet. In the meantime, they keep the burning being fed and happy, or as happy as it can be. It will never be truly satisfied until a day arrives where it can be permitted to spread as far and wide as it wishes, to burn and feed and engulf everything in sight. Let's hope that day never comes, but if you start to feel unusually hot, if the walls seem to suddenly blacken around you, and you hear the final crackles before the hissing tongues of flame lick at your bubbling skin, well, by that point, it'll already be too late.
In 1961, the SCP Foundation discovered a town that was completely devoid of all life. Not long before their arrival, Darrington, North Carolina had been a community with high aspirations, a deeply religious township of devout Christians, many of whom were seeking greater prosperity from their lives. But now their home was a ghost town, with no sign of any prior Darrington resident to be found. Where in the hell had they all gone? It hardly seemed like the population of an entire town would all simultaneously decide to up sticks and leave to pastures new. But then again, maybe the citizens of Darrington hadn't left at all. Perhaps they weren't even really still human and had taken up residence somewhere much darker, like underground. This is the story of one of the earliest known instances of a phenomenon now known under the designation of SCP-3089, or to use its alternative name, that old-time religion. When the SCP Foundation arrived in a desolate Darrington to find the townsfolk had all vanished, they immediately began an investigation into the exact hows and whys, the answers to what exactly had happened here. After all, while not a huge place, Darrington was home to nearly 1,000 residents, and that many people don't just disappear, if they even had disappeared and weren't just dormant. But what the Foundation uncovered was a gruesome discovery that led them to not only demolishing the entire North Carolinian town, but purchasing all the land around it to keep the area under permanent observation. Prior to the demolition, however, the Ministry of Sevenfold Blessing had been one of the oldest buildings in Darrington, much like most town churches. And it was while searching the offices of this church that the Foundation cleanup crews discovered their first piece of evidence, the initial clue about what had happened to this deserted town. They recovered a series of cassette tapes, each with a recording of sermons that had been given within the Ministry of Sevenfold Blessing. These were all delivered by one Pastor Bartholomew Jenner, the first having been recorded on August 17th of 1959, 2 years earlier.
My friends, I want to talk to you about what the Bible offers tonight.
Pastor Jenner began in the first of these recordings.
I want to talk to you about what you are owed. I want to talk to those of you who are struggling right now. To those of you who have hardship and pain. Maybe you've heard that the Bible only nourishes the spirit, that God only provides for our immortal souls. Well, my friends, I'm here to tell you that this is simply not true.
Pastor Bartholomew Jenner seemed to be focused on the discussion of very real, relatable problems. After all, what person hasn't felt unsatisfied with their life at one point or another? And this was apparently no different for the people of Darrington.
Many of you can think of places in your lives where you have not yet risen, where you are not yet victorious. Marriage, finances, health. But do not fret, my friends, God wants you to rise. He has cleared a path for you. It is one littered with his earthly treasures. To claim them, you only need to shed your old selves and be reborn.
The pastor was merely using the shared faith of the township to help reaffirm that their struggles were not the be-all end-all of their lives. Or at least, that's how it first appeared. But the religious practices taking place in this first recording would soon take a bizarre turn, making it clear there was something far more sinister, even cult-like, going on in the Ministry of Sevenfold Blessing.
Now, if you would, some of the ladies from the mayor's office were kind enough to collect these cicada shells. Pass along, each of you take one. Yes, the children too. Be careful, very careful. They are fragile. Each of you take one and hold it in your left hand. Yes, the left hand, not the right. Your left.
The shells of dead cicadas hardly seemed like common fare for a sermon like this. Although as the recording continued, it was easy to understand that Pastor Jenner intended these discarded insect carapaces to be something of a metaphor, even if they were pretty gross, especially to some of the younger members of his congregation. He explained to the Darrington residents that these cicada shells were meant to be symbolic of whatever hardship the citizens were currently struggling with in their lives, whether it was work, a marriage, or an ill family member. Then came the next part of this unorthodox practice. The pastor instructed everyone in the congregation to picture themselves holding their biggest problem in their left hand.
Now I want you to squeeze your left hand. Squeeze it into a fist. Feel that problem cracking like old dried out paper. Feel it crumble to dust.
Jenner told them, and the residents of Darrington did so, crushing the cicada shells until there was nothing left.
Everyone open your eyes. Don't you feel better? Stronger. This is what is offered. Our hardships are like the shell. We shall cast them aside even as they crumble. God has cleared a path.
Needless to say, the Foundation agents that recovered the tapes of Pastor Jenner's odd sermons weren't exactly sure what to make of them. And as unusual as they were, the recordings did little to indicate where the townspeople of Darrington, North Carolina had disappeared to. But as they listened further, what they found was even more unsettling than an entire congregation of people crushing cicada shells. In the second recording, dated December 19th of 1959, Pastor Jenner was once again presiding over his congregation. He had just finished quoting a passage from Matthew chapter 25, verse 30, which related to a biblical tale known as the Parable of the Talents. In this story, a master puts his servants in charge of a differently sized portion of his wealth while he is away, then judges them based on whether or not his servants make a profit using his money. The third servant, who had received the least talents, meaning an amount of money, was punished for burying his share in the ground.
Cast out into the outer darkness, to face weeping and gnashing of teeth.
It was after making mention of this unprofitable servant that Pastor Jenner went on to address even more of the bizarre, almost ritualistic practices he had been introducing to his sermons.
Now, some of you have expressed concerns over the new sacraments. A few have even called them sacrilege. And yet, have we not prospered? Have these same naysayers, these same doubting Thomases, not profited from our good works?
The pastor declared.
I have shown you how to heal the sick with the Lord's Prayer and the blood of an unbaptized child. I have shown you how to see your future in the stemming entrails of a quivering crow. I have shown you the path to glory, but I cannot make you follow this path. I can only show it to you. It is you and you alone who must follow it, who must rise and shed your old self.
Shed your old self. The words immediately called to mind the image of the cicadas, insects that discard their outer carapaces and emerge anew, bugs that also burrow into the ground and wait, lying dormant under the earth for years at a time, all before they emerge, rising up again so they can spread. It was becoming clear that Pastor Jenner was certainly deviating further and further from the church's normal religious practices. His bold and blatant descriptions of what sounded like ritualistic sacrifices were shocking enough to hear, speaking of using blood and entrails to bring the town the prosperity it sought. But if that wasn't bad enough, the worst was still yet to come, contained within the third and final recording. Unlike the previous cassettes, most of the sermon from June 7, 1960 was almost completely unintelligible, and without any visual evidence to go along with it. It was hard for the Foundation to make out exactly what was going on. It began with another quote from Matthew, this time chapter 28, verse 6, which made mention of the resurrection of Jesus, that he had risen, and that people should come and see where the Lord lay.
Not a metaphor, my friends,
Pastor Jenner explained before urging his congregation to join in some kind of formation.
Step forward, mothers behind their daughters, fathers behind their sons. Turn to face
The recording became unintelligible again after that point, with only a few more words being audible. The pastor seemed to have gathered the townsfolk of Darrington, presumably for some new form of ritual. He encouraged the town's children to close their eyes and pray, before reminding the congregation that God sacrificed the life of his only son, Jesus. Frighteningly, it appeared that Pastor Jenner was implying the adults of Darrington should do the same. One of the next fragments of his sermon that could be deciphered declared,
"Lamb is slaughtered to feed the lion. The son is slaughtered to feed."
Between more and more noise interfering with the recording, Pastor Jenner could be heard saying,
"The pact is complete. This world shall be our paradise,"
before he encouraged his congregation, or those who were left, to dig deep and wait. Then came perhaps the most horrifying part of the tape. The remainder of the recording lasted 30 minutes, comprised of pure static. Or the Foundation agents listening to it assumed at first that it was just interference, but further audio analysis seemed to suggest that the long, continuous mass of hissing wasn't static at all. It was the chittering sound of insects, like the noise made by cicadas. For a time, the incident at Darrington left the Foundation baffled. There seemed to be no clear answer as to what had happened. Not one of the town's residents were anywhere to be found, and on top of that, there were no bodies, no remains of any kind to speak of. If they were dead, there would at least be some kind of trace. And then there were all the questions raised by Pastor Bartholomew Jenner's strange sermons. Why did he seem so focused on enacting rituals? Did any of his methods really benefit the town? And why did he place so much emphasis on cicadas, of all things? Answers were few and far between. Although almost 6 decades after the Foundation discovered the desolate town of Darrington, a new development would come to light. To be more accurate, it was 56 years later. On the 11th of January 2017, a Foundation agent named Daniel Mitchell was patrolling the area that had formerly been Darrington, North Carolina, before the Foundation had demolished all traces of the town. By this point, the SCP Foundation had long thought that they had figured out exactly what SCP-3089 was. They had even encountered it emerging in a number of different forms in both 2007 and 2015. However, it was what Daniel Mitchell happened across during the routine monthly patrol that revealed the horrifying truth. At the outskirts of the area where the town had once been, a series of sinkholes had opened up at some point between the previous monthly check and this one in early 2017. And if you think that these sinkholes caused a disturbance in the earth and uncovered all the bodies of the former residents of Darrington, you'd be wrong. It was far, far stranger. The Foundation conducted a full-scale examination of the sinkholes around the demolished North Carolinian town. And these weren't just a few patches of loose ground that had sunk through. The geological survey the Foundation carried out quickly revealed that these sinkholes led to an extensive network of tunnels underground. They extended several hundred kilometers outwards, practically covering the entire underside of where Darrington had been. The tunnels seemed far too big than any other created by any natural means, but the entire network also appeared too rudimentary, too imperfect to have been carved using any modern excavation technology, like a large drill. Plus, if any equipment like that had been on site, the Foundation would have noticed, as they kept the area monitored. It was almost like something had been burrowing through the ground, only to eventually crawl back up to the surface, resulting in the sinkholes. What's more, the Foundation's geological tests suggested that the network of tunnels was almost 4 decades old. That would have placed the date of their creation about 10 years after the disappearance of everyone in Darrington. Naturally, the Foundation immediately launched a mission to explore more of the tunnels. Before even completing a full sweep of the underground space in its entirety, they had made another discovery. Contained within the tunnels was over a whole ton of organic material that had been mostly preserved without decomposing too much. The SCP Foundation began gathering samples for testing, finding most of this material to be severely desiccated dermis tissue. That is the dense layer of skin beneath the epidermis, and it had all been entirely dried out. But that wasn't all the testing uncovered. According to genetic analysis, the tissue had 2 distinct types of DNA present. The first being easily identified as human genetic material, which made sense. Despite the material lacking in moisture, the dermis tissue didn't match the skin of any other mammal. But then there was the other DNA present. Combined with the expected human DNA was the presence of something else that the Foundation researchers had quite some difficulty finding a match for. Eventually, they determined that this genetic material entangled with the human DNA belonged to the Cicadata montana, better known as the New Forest cicada. Cicadas, again. Cicada DNA mixed with human DNA, discovered in a large network of underground tunnels, all beneath the same town where a pastor had his congregation crush cicada shells in their left hands during one of his sermons. 10 years before the sinkhole incident, the Foundation was alerted to a particular YouTube channel by the name of Kai Sanchez Positively Rich. On the surface, Kai was one of the many online grifters preaching about how easy it was to quickly achieve an obscene amount of wealth by simply believing in yourself. Usually, if not always, these types of people were trying to scam their audience of loyal subscribers into investing in some kind of illicit money-making scheme or any number of other cons, promising their followers easy money that never came. But Kai Sanchez's channel was slightly different, so much so that the Foundation had to contain his entire audience, deeming them to have been affected by SCP-3089. The video that caught the Foundation's attention was an hour-long upload from Kai, entitled 7 Secrets to Ascend the Ladder of Prosperity. There was that word again. Prosperity. The same thing Pastor Jenner had promised his entire congregation in Darrington. And the similarities didn't end there. In his video, much like the pastor during his sermons, Kai Sanchez encouraged his audience to visualize their success in order to achieve it. He implied that the human consciousness could impact reality. For example, if his viewers just imagine themselves having a bigger bank account or looking more attractive, then these things would manifest themselves into the real world. One of Kai's secrets to ascend the ladder of prosperity was as follows.
Visualize your ascendance. Reimagine yourself as someone who can reach the top of that ladder. Shed your old identity, tear it off, throw it aside like dead skin. You won't need it, not where you're going.
The resemblance to Pastor Jenner's sermons was uncanny. Kai's video even encouraged that his audience leave scraps out to lure stray cats into their homes, and then, once they had one, to take a knife and, well, you remember what happened in Darrington. But Kai Sanchez made sure to specify,
remember to hold the knife with your left hand.
Another online community was tagged by the Foundation for similar teachings. This group of insular men were trying to apply the same methodology primarily to attract women. However, they also reasoned it could be used to improve their own financial status and physical stature, all done through visualizing and believing that doing so would make these things improve, that having faith would grant them prosperity. This disturbed community even tried to use bug rattlers to emit frequencies to aid in attracting women. Contained within these rattlers were the preserved remains of cicadas. Male cicadas have tymbals, structures on their outer shell that emit a loud hissing, chittering noise that they often use to find a mate after spending so much time dormant underground before burrowing up to the surface. And if you've been paying attention, you might be able to guess exactly where this is going. SCP-3089 is a phenomenon that occurs within communities of people who are seeking some form of prosperity. Whether that community be a town, a group of like-minded people online, or any other group of collected individuals. The particular type of prosperity these people are all seeking can be anything from spiritual enlightenment to financial success. The SCP Foundation does not yet quite understand exactly how SCP-3089 starts, only that the communities affected by it will attempt to achieve their chosen material success through the application of rituals, like visualizing what they hope to overcome and achieve, and practicing sacrifices. In short, these people have to believe these acts will grant them what they want. They need to be willing to go far enough to do unspeakable things. They need to have faith. Although what they don't realize is, some things can feed on that faith. They can harvest it. Before these communities realize the terrible things that they have done, or who exactly has tricked them into performing these rituals, they'll begin to undergo a horrific transformation process, known as SCP-3089-B. It begins in the chrysalis stage. Members of a community that have been affected by SCP-3089 will experience a declined state of metabolism, now classified as an instance of SCP-3089-A. Their brain activity, heart rate, and body temperature will all begin to lower. Over a period of between 3 and 6 hours, these people will then suffer a change to their epidermis, the outer layer of skin. It starts to harden until it has formed a dense, brittle substance, like a shell. Next comes the second stage of SCP-3089-B, metamorphosis. Internally, SCP-3089-A individuals will develop a number of tetromas, a type of germ cell tumor that can contain several different types of tissue, such as hair, muscle, and bone. During the next 2 or 3 weeks, these tumors will expand and dissolve the person's soft tissue. Then there's the final stage, emergence. An instance of SCP-3089-A will exit its dormant state that began in the initial stage. Once they have awoken, then something exits the outer epidermal shell. It will not communicate. Some will retain remnants of internal organs, such as eyes or lungs. However, these are vestigial, no longer serving any purpose. The brain functions deviate from any normal human patterns. Having completed the process, this thing will attempt to burrow down into the soil via any means at its disposal. An outer shell, digging into the soil. The tunnels underneath Darrington, the genetic material uncovered below.
dermis tissue with 2 types of DNA, a mix of human and cicada. There is something out there. It is preying on people's faith, their longing for prosperity. Then when these communities are presented with someone who can take advantage of that faith, like Pastor Jenner or Kai Sanchez, they find themselves encouraged to push their faith to its furthest limit. And then they are rewarded by becoming something else, something nightmarish. The question is, when they wake up and crawl back out from their tunnels, leaving a sinkhole in their wake, where do these cicada creatures go? Russell's back was pressed against the wall, his shuddering hands gripping the fire axe. The low emergency lighting filling the corridor indicated the lockdown was still in effect, although that was simultaneously a blessing and a curse. Sure, it meant that thing couldn't get out, hopefully, but it also meant that Russell was stuck in the wing of the facility with it. He had no idea if anyone else was left. He hadn't seen what had happened to Carpenter. Maybe it got him, or perhaps he had managed to give it the slip at the last second. There was no way of knowing for sure. It had all started so simply, so innocently, and with such noble intentions. If he had known it would lead to all this madness, Russell would have never put his name down on the request form. The SCP Foundation had been working on a way to neutralize or cure SCP-610 for what felt like forever. To one team of scientists, the infamously so-called flesh that hates was a fascinating organism. It was a highly contagious sarkic skin disease, isolated entirely within a small area of Siberia. That on its own wasn't enough to pique the interest of the research team led by Dr. Carpenter, including his hand-picked star researchers Russell and David, along with their assistant Clennon and Dr. Botten, an expert on infectious diseases who had recently joined their efforts to provide his specialist knowledge. What did captivate all of them, however, was what SCP-610 did when it infected a human being. The disease would trigger aggressive and uncontrollable mutations within its infected and could virtually rewrite their entire physiology in a heartbeat. The flesh that hates was capable of transforming a person's body into a horrifying fleshy mass of limbs and matter that barely resembled a human being anymore. And in addition, the infected individuals would retain some level of awareness, attacking any uninfected person with extreme hostility. There had long been chatter amongst some other research teams studying SCP-610 about devising a way to weaponize the disease. If they could somehow create a variant that didn't turn people into monsters, or at least cause the fleshy abominations to die shortly after mutation, then the Foundation or another interested party could deploy the flesh that hates as a biological weapon. Dr. Carpenter had long abhorred the idea, instead searching for a way to completely reverse the effects of an SCP-610 infection. It may have been idealistic, perhaps even naive by some standards, but the rest of his team was behind him in the pursuit of that noble goal, although not one of them knew it would soon cost them their lives. Hitting speed bump after speed bump in their research, the team were beginning to lose hope. Researcher David was the most outspoken in how tired he was of seeing the same results, yelling in frustration that the flesh could not be cured by conventional means. However, it was that outburst that gave Russell the idea. They had tried treating SCP-610 like a common virus, as if it was any other form of disease, largely thanks to Dr. Botten's input. And granted, that approach had taught them a lot about the flesh's ability to contaminate a subject from a single cell. But this infection was anomalous through and through. Could the solution to eradicating it for good lie not in a medical cure, but in another SCP? Russell brought this hypothesis to the rest of the research team, and each of them had suggestions for other anomalies they could potentially use to cure a subject of the flesh that hates. "We could get SCP-049 to take a look at the infected patient," Clennon suggested. "Oh, might work," Carpenter mused. "Although even if he cures someone, he might also kill them. He has his whole deal about ridding the world of the pestilence could prove to be a problem." There's always 682, David said dryly. "Have the reptile eat up all the SCP-610 infectees and voila, problem solved." "Oh, real helpful, David," researcher Russell retorted. "And what are we gonna do when SCP-682 adapts to the flesh? You really want an infected immortal lizard on the loose?" "Gentlemen, please," Dr. Botten spoke up. "We're forgetting one obvious option. I propose we submit a joint formal request to use SCP-914 for this experiment. Unanimously, the group all agreed that this was the best course of action. SCP-914, or the Clockworks, was a giant machine with 2 booths marked Input and Output. Although the Foundation still couldn't fully comprehend exactly how SCP-914 seemed to take any object placed within it and disassemble, recreate, improve, or destroy the item depending on its current setting. There was one issue, however. A prior failed experiment wherein a D-class was placed in SCP-914 had led to some pretty disastrous consequences. As a result, ever since, no organic matter was to be placed within the Clockworks, a rule that the team's experiment with the flesh would breach. Still, they pressed on, each of the 5 researchers signing their request to utilize SCP-914 before it was submitted to the Foundation higher-ups. Within hours, the request was denied, but the team was determined that SCP-914 could be the key to solving the Foundation's long-standing issue with SCP-610. Dr. Carpenter repealed the decision, urging the higher-ups to reconsider. He argued that this flouting of the no organic matter rule was necessary to potentially rid the world of the flesh that hates. After a few days of consideration, the request was finally, fatefully, granted. The team went to work immediately, requisitioning 2 test subjects, both of which had suffered SCP-610 infections and were horribly mutated. The pair of them were deemed a potential hazard to every member of Foundation staff on site, and as a result, the entire wing of the facility where the Clockworks was housed had to be evacuated for safety. Dressed in biohazard suits to protect themselves, the researchers used an electric cattle prod to coax the first flesh specimen into the input chamber of SCP-914. This was the test run. They wanted to see if the Clockworks would actually be able to affect those infected with SCP-610 at all. Plus, they needed a failsafe just in case something went wrong, and luckily the machine had just the thing. Russell asked Clement to set the Clockworks to rough, and with a click and whir of its numerous gears and gyros, SCP-914 came to life. Instantly, the infected test subject was completely obliterated. The setting had reduced it to atoms, disintegrating it on such a microscopic level that there was nothing left in the output chamber. The second infected creature seemed to bristle with anger, but didn't attack or become aggressive, as it too was prodded towards the Clockworks. Next, perhaps out of fear that their theory might be wrong, the team agreed to set SCP-914 to its 1-to-1 setting. Sure enough, the machine recreated another instance of a specimen infected with the flesh that hates, replacing the previous one. "We all know we're stalling," researcher David piped up. "Let's do what we came here for. Set the Clockworks to course." Nervously receiving a nod from Dr. Carpenter, Clennon stepped forward to switch the dial on SCP-914 to the course setting. This was the primary reason the team had all agreed to use the machine on a flesh specimen. This setting could disassemble any item placed in the input booth, separating it into its base components. Botten had suggested the use of SCP-914 based on the theory that, if it worked correctly, the Clockworks could extract the flesh that hates from its infected host, rendering them free of the disease. The machine made a colossal amount of noise as Clennon hurried back to a safe distance with the others. But as it was powering up, seconds from activating, Dr. Carpenter noticed something. The color drained from his face as he saw it. None of the others had noticed from a distance that the dial hadn't been set to coarse. Instead, it pointed to very fine, the highest refinement setting 914 had.
What the hell have you done?
Carpenter yelled at Clennon before the machine suddenly activated. What stepped free from the output booth stunned the researcher. It was a man, a seemingly ordinary human, who had presumably been infected by SCP-610 some time ago. He stepped nervously out of the machine, looking confused for a moment as a pair of Foundation security guards cautiously approached him. "We did it," Russell said in awe. Suddenly, fleshy tendrils burst forth from the man's arms, latching on to the approaching guards. They screamed in agony, their bodies melting become a bloody, misshapen mass that stayed attached to the humanoid creature at the center. It was like they became a part of it, the guards' arms and legs forming additional limbs as their forms were reconstituted and repurposed as part of a monster that was now crawling on its 6 legs towards the research team. In a blind panic, the group scrambled for the entrance, the head of the infected man splitting open down the middle, opening up into a wide, snapping pair of jaws. Panting hard as he ran, his breath fogging up the clear faceplate of the biohazard suit, Russell ran through the door, hearing someone close behind. He stopped for a moment, looking back to see the creature on the other side of the door starting to spill through the doorframe like a liquid. Running faster around a corner, Russell came to another halt in the common area. A third security guard following just before a thick steel security door came slamming down, sealing the creature on the other side.
The other door didn't hold it. What good is that going to do? Researcher David yelled. More to the point,
Dr. Carpenter said, turning and marching towards Glennon. He launched a furious punch at the assistant, knocking him to the floor.
Why did you set 914 to very fine, Glennon?
The enraged doctor shouted.
You're the one who unleashed that abomination, you maniac!
What? Glennon replied, fearfully trembling.
I didn't. I swear I didn't. It said course. I'm sure of it. You expect us to believe that was a mistake? Gentlemen, we need to focus on the situation at hand.
The security officer interjected.
Regardless of who's responsible, we need to inform the Foundation higher-ups.
There's an emergency lockdown, Russell replied. It would have triggered the moment the SCP-610 specimen got free.
You've trapped us with a monster, Glennon!
Dr. Carpenter spat. Hold on, Researcher David spoke up. Wasn't it Botton's idea to use 914 in the first place? The common area fell silent as everyone turned to look at Dr. Botton. Did you plan for this, Doc? David pushed. Botton chuckled. Need I remind you, my friends, that we all agreed to use the clockworks, did we not? All of our names are on the request, he answered. Besides, accusing me, David, that's rather rich coming from you. What's that supposed to mean? The researcher fired back. Beckoning his finger, Botton encouraged the rest of the team to follow him across the common area to where a row of lockers stood, each door bearing one of their names. He gestured to the one labeled David. Go on, Botton added. Shooting him a dirty look, David barged past the disease expert and opened his locker. Not one among the group expected what would fall out. It was an old leather-bound book, symbols carved into the front cover. Instantly, thanks to the work studying SCP-610, the researchers all knew a text on sarcasm when they saw one. It had been long known that the flesh that hates was often described in texts revered by Sarkic cults, who worship death, decay, and disease.
What the hell, David?
Russell exclaimed, picking up the book and examining it in disbelief.
You're a Sarkist?
Carpenter asked, the fury in his voice already elevating.
No, I'm not!
Researcher David protested.
I've never seen that before. It was in your locker,
the doctor yelled.
You're one of those cannibal cultists. This was your plan, to refine the flesh for your twisted, death-worshipping religion.
It certainly seems that way, Botton interjected. After all, Researcher David did seem frustrated at our earlier results. Impatient, even.
You!
David pointed at the doctor.
You planted this in my locker!
You're here a Sarkist, Glennon repeated in a nervous stammer. You made me turn the dial to very fine. You made that thing appear.
You made me your accomplice!
Anger tears streamed down his face. Glennon's hand reached for the security officer's gun and went to draw it, planning to shoot David on the spot. But as he went to pull the weapon from the guard's holster, it wouldn't budge. It was then that Assistant Glennon stared in horror at his hand. His fingers had fused to the guard's leg. The officer gave a twisted grin as his torso burst open, tendrils of flesh latching onto Glennon and assimilating him. Just like it had done before, the flesh creature broke down its victim's body, making it a new part of itself, a grotesque mass of limbs and bloody matter, littered with the discarded faces of those it had infected. The research team looked at it terrified, their stomachs turning, disgusted at the growing, growling abomination of bodies fused to one another. Oh, you're beautiful, Russell heard a voice whisper behind him. He turned to see Botton, looking at the SCP-610 creature and smiling. Researcher David was the closest, and the creature lunged at him, pulling his leg out from under him. Screaming in fear, the researcher fell onto the ground and was dragged towards the flesh. It pulled him in, his body stretching, skin tearing and bones snapping as he became part of it. A new set of limbs added to the monster. Dr. Carpenter went to try and pull him free, but it was already too late. But he stepped back, knowing that if he touched it, he would be infected too. The sound of running caught Russell's attention, and he spotted Botton making a break for it. Grabbing Dr. Carpenter by the sleeve, the researcher pulled him in the same direction, partly running away from the flesh as it assimilated David, and partly chasing the Sarkic saboteur. The pair of them quickly caught up to Botton, leaning over himself and panting breathlessly. Thank God you two made it, he wheezed after the run.
I can't believe David could do this to unleash this nightmare upon us.
Russell thought to snap at him, to scream how dare he keep lying, but Botton's back was to him now. He'd never get a better chance. There was a cabinet on the corridor wall containing a fire axe for emergencies. As carefully and quietly as he could, Russell fished the axe out of its case whilst Botton and Carpenter were looking away.
We should get the Foundation to lift the lockdown, Botton was saying. They need to let us out and then— Oh! Oh!
He let out a blood-curdling scream mid-sentence as the axe blade wounded him. Russell pulled it back, standing over the doctor as he fell to the floor in agony.
Russell, have you lost your mind?
Carpenter exclaimed. No, Doctor. He's the cultist. I have no idea how he tricked Glennon, but that flesh creature exists because of him, the researcher answered. From the floor, unable to move thanks to his injury, Dr. Botton began to laugh.
It took me years to infiltrate the Foundation. So much time waiting to gain access to that blessed flesh, he gloated. And now you've helped me to refine it, to create its ultimate form. You want to kill me? Go ahead, Russell. My life doesn't matter. For once that creature is free, it will bring about a new age of flesh, and Grand Karcist Iron will reward me for the role I played in unleashing it.
David was right, Carpenter realized.
Botton, you've planted that book on him to throw us off.
Doctor, we need to think of something, Researcher Russell interjected, axe still in hand. Nobody knows more about the flesh that hates than us. There must be a way to kill that thing. Otherwise, if it gets out of this lockdown, it could spread to everyone in the Foundation. What about fire? That's been effective against 610 infectees before, right?
Yes, but
the doctor desperately tried to think.
This new being we've created, he created,
Russell argued, looking at the grimacing, wounded Botton.
We cannot deny the role we've all played in this, Researcher, Carpenter argued. And we have no idea if it possesses the same weaknesses as the flesh before its refinement. But we have to try, sir, the researcher protested.
Of course, I agree. The sickening sound of a slithering, slick mass was rapidly approaching. Still laying on the floor in pain, Dr. Botton had been dragged to the middle of a junction, with Carpenter and Russell hiding around either corner. Suddenly, Botton started hollering as the flesh came into view, practically calling it to him.
Oh, look at you! He exclaimed. You're better than I could have ever hoped for!
Looking down at him with the faces it had collected, the creature stabbed one of its disgusting appendages through Botton, drawing its body into its growing form.
I am honored to give my life so that the age of flesh may begin,
the doctor said weakly, through the pain as he was infected. From around the corner, Carpenter had taken the Sarkic text and set its pages on fire with a cigarette lighter. Turning to the creature, he hurled the mass of burning paper at it, hoping it would be enough fire to spread to the flesh while it was assimilating Botton, who they had left there as bait. The fiery book collided with the monstrosity. As Russell peeked around the corner, he saw the flesh retreating from the flames, Botton's body now added to it. For a moment, it seemed like the creature was afraid of the fire, but slowly it drew nearer and nearer to the book. With ease, it stamped down the flames with Botton's leg, dousing the fire and suffering no damage to it at all. Gripping the axe in his hands, Russell went to charge at the creature, only to feel something push him back. Dr. Carpenter had stopped him.
Run!
He yelled. Instantly, Russell turned and raced down the corridor, the sound of fleshy tentacles whipping through the air. He dared not look back, just in case the monster was right behind him. Eventually, he reached another corner and slammed his back against it, hands shuddering as he held on to the fire axe. He had no idea what had happened to Carpenter. Maybe it got him, or perhaps he had managed to give it the slip at the last second.
Russell!
Came a hushed voice from around the corner, one the researcher recognized. He turned to see Dr. Carpenter approaching him, sneaking like he was trying to avoid being heard.
I think I managed to give it the slip,
the doctor whispered. For a second, Russell backed up, his hands tightening around the axe handle. This might have looked like Dr. Carpenter, but was it?
Are you really you, Doctor?
He asked.
Of course I am,
Carpenter replied.
You don't think that I'm not that monstrosity?
Russell raised the axe defensively, only to notice the sadness in the doctor's face. Unable to bring himself to swing, even to find out, the researcher lowered his weapon. Carpenter looked grateful.
Come on, let's get them to lift this lockdown, he said. I'm sure an MTF can step in and take care of our mistake.
As the pair of them cautiously made their way towards one of the locked doors, Dr. Carpenter reached out a hand to place it on Russell's shoulder. Even before she was a fully fledged doctor, Kate Barker always had a fascination for the outdoors. Growing up, being out among nature felt like she was connected to the wider world, one part of a larger whole. She intuited from a very young age that the Earth had a system in place full of millions, if not billions of parts that all work together in the hopes of achieving perfect balance. Humans, animals, and insects, right down to the germs that were so small they couldn't be seen unless under a microscope. And then, of course, there were the plants, trees, flowers, and all manner of other flora that provided the world with so much more than making it look beautiful. And it was so much so that a young Kate wanted to devote her life to helping maintain our beautiful little blue and green planet and understand every part of it. The way she did that changed as the years went on. As a child, it was learning how trees take in carbon dioxide and water, then use the sun's energy to feed themselves and produce oxygen through a process known as photosynthesis. Then, in high school, Kate was writing and giving presentations on the importance of protecting the environment and conserving wildlife, trying to convince her classmates to see the world in the same way she did. By the time college rolled around, that protection took on a seemingly more proactive form, standing out on picket lines in protest when the college announced it would be chopping down its nearby woods to expand the campus. Eventually, she was made Dr. Kate Barker and awarded her PhD in botany and plant science. She thought that would be when the real work began. Having climbed her way up to achieving her degree was only the first step. The next would involve working tirelessly to keep the world's greenery alive. After all, Kate had studied for years, learning about anything and everything to do with plant life, their different functions and structures, how each species had evolved and could be classified, and how they all formed part of the planet's ecosystem. Unfortunately, even for those with the noblest of intentions, the harsh, unforgiving laws of reality can tend to get in the way. In Kate's case, that came in the form of being snapped up for a job at a genetic research company. Sure, on the one hand, she did get to rely on all the information she had learned on her way to earning her PhD, but on the downside, all Kate got to use her knowledge for was receiving and tending to various plant samples. Getting asked occasionally to run tests on said samples was about the pinnacle of excitement in her job. Somehow, despite working with plants, Dr. Barker couldn't help but feel further away from nature than she had ever been. That was until an unusual specimen was brought to her department for analysis, something unlike anything Kate had seen in all her years of research and study. Although she didn't know it at the time, this unique plant would bring Dr. Barker closer to nature in a way she could never have imagined, because it was a sample of SCP-006. Of course, at the time, and even after the plant's anomalous properties began to take effect, Kate was completely unaware of this. When it was first brought to her lab, it seemed like just an ordinary fungus. No one had been able to successfully identify it, however, but if anyone could, Dr. Kate Barker was perhaps the best qualified person. Where was it found? She asked the lab technician as he handed her the sample secured in a sealed, airtight container. Pretty close to here, apparently, the lab tech replied. Louisiana swamps are always full of mushrooms and stuff like this, right? Yes, that's true. There are quite a few different fungi native to Louisiana, Kate answered instinctively, like her brain was on autopilot. She was more focused on examining the sample in the box than the conversation. Thing is, no one knows what kind this is, or if it's dangerous. I heard a rumor the locals used to call it frog rot, but apparently that was an older name for it, the technician added, garnering a little more than a mumble of agreement from the doctor of botany. Kate placed the clear Perspex container near the window, letting the natural light of the outdoors give her a better look at what was inside. It was a portion of a dead tree, its bark soggy and darkened from the swamp water. Growing out of its side was a cluster of the mysterious fungus in question, looking more like pustules or a cyst, a tumor growing out of the dead wood, as if it had drained the bigger plant of all of its life. Kate's next few hours were spent taking samples of the fungus, keeping her hands and face covered as she scraped away parts of it to examine under her microscope. There was little abnormal about it on a cellular level, nothing in testing to suggest that the sample was toxic or directly harmful. All Kate could decipher about the plant was that it was related to a certain genus of fungi, known as Trichophyton, which includes the same parasitic varieties of fungus that can cause athlete's foot, ringworm, and similar infections in humans. Still unable to fully identify the species, Kate decided to take a closer look at how it was growing. Putting the container behind a safety screen, she opened it up and began to pull apart the sodden tree bark with her gloved hands. There was definitely some kind of mass underneath the bark, what Kate initially assumed to be the wood of the tree that the fungus had taken root to. Nothing could have prepared her for how wrong she was. As the bark split apart and crumbled away, it revealed what was underneath: a cottontail swamp rabbit. The fungi took on even more of a tumor-like appearance when Dr. Barker saw that it was actually growing out of the rabbit's back, having actually taken root within the poor creature's body. As much as the sight of it was profoundly upsetting, even a little sickening, the scientists and Kate knew that this was all just part of nature taking its course. Once she got over the initial shock, it was even a little fascinating. Her botanical expertise was second to none, and through that knowledge, she knew that more fungi grew in damp conditions. But she had never seen any genus grow from the biological matter of another organism, dead nor alive. Could this mystery species grow in any biomass, even in a human being? Worried about that possibility, Kate went to store the SCP-006 sample until further testing could be conducted. As she placed it back in the container, her hand nudged one of the fungi's bulbs, causing it to expel a wisp of tiny spores. Not that she could see them, of course. They were microscopically small, but as they drifted through the air, the spores were drawn to Kate, up and towards where she was steadily breathing. The minute the spores slipped undetected into her airway, Dr. Barker immediately began coughing, feeling a disgusting earthy tang at the back of her throat. She couldn't stop spluttering, instinctively raising her hand to cover her mouth. Her rubber gloves were still covering her fingers, coating in even more invisible residue from the fungus, and now Kate was unknowingly breathing in more. Excusing herself from work from the rest of the day, Dr. Kate Barker went home feeling sicker and sicker as every minute passed. A fever was rapidly climbing, limbs were shuddering, and still she couldn't stop coughing and spluttering as she tried to expel a foul, lingering sensation that refused to leave her throat. But those weren't even the worst symptoms. 2 days had come and gone since the incident at the lab, and Kate still hadn't returned to her job. How could she? She felt awful and looked far worse. Large lesions had started appearing on her skin, rapidly turning into warts. Just looking at them made Kate's stomach turn, and on a few occasions, poking at them and feeling these alien lumps on her skin caused her to vomit. Every night she would go to bed, her body rapidly switching from sweltering hot, then becoming cold enough to cause Kate to shiver uncontrollably. At first it looked like the lesions were clearing, falling away from her skin soon after they had fully formed into warts. But the fleeting bit of hope that gave her was quickly wiped away when new ones started to grow in their place. This didn't just feel like the flu, or any other type of sickness for that matter. It felt painful on the deepest, tiniest level. During what little restless sleep she did get, Kate kept having nightmares about doctors looking at her cells under a microscope, watching them changing into something else. It had been over 2 weeks since she had first been exposed to SCP-006's spores, and still, she hadn't been well enough to get back to work. Each time Kate had called the Human Resources Department to inform them that she still wasn't any better, they always came out with the same advice: drink plenty of fluids, try to eat, and keep your strength up. Dr. Barker hadn't stopped eating or drinking, albeit at a very slightly reduced rate. Her appetite had been sapped, along with most of her energy, although she had noticed that she dropped a significant amount of weight in an alarmingly short amount of time. 3 weeks later, Kate flicked on the bathroom light and barely recognized herself. Not only was she no longer at a healthy weight, but her skin. Something was very wrong with her skin. She had developed an abnormal pigmentation, a yellowish-greenish hue, almost like she had somehow developed jaundice. But to the touch, it felt a strange, almost rubbery texture. In fact, if she hadn't felt so sick, Kate would have noticed that her skin wasn't absorbing water the way it was used to either, displaying the same type of permeability as the skin of most amphibians. 2 months had gone past, and nobody at the research company had heard a word from Kate. She wasn't answering her phone. A few of them were asked to go to her apartment to check on her, but she never came to the door either. None of them had any idea what had happened. They certainly didn't know about the changes that her body had undergone, and none of them painlessly either. The constant pain Kate had been feeling had gradually built and built until it felt like parts of her body were twisting and contorting against her will and in unnatural ways. With the grinding feeling of her bones pulling each other as they shrank, her limbs were racked with unbearable agony. At the same time, her stomach had shrunk to the point where she wasn't even able to eat anymore. The same reduction was occurring to the rest of her organs too. Heart, liver, lungs, brain, everything was getting smaller, shrinking organs imprisoned within the skeleton that was also decreasing in size. Then, one morning, the pain had seemingly stopped, After a night spent screaming in sheer agony, tears streaming down her face, Kate woke up on the floor of her apartment under a pile of her clothes. But as she awoke, she instantly noticed something. Everything looked bigger. The whole room towered above her like she had been reduced down to the size of something much smaller than a human. She tried opening her mouth to say something, anything, but her lips couldn't form words anymore. Her arms felt strange, too, like their reach was somehow much shorter. The same with her legs that were now tucked under her body, her tiny rubbery-skinned body. SCP-006 had turned her into a frog. It took Kate almost an entire day to figure out how to properly move around, first needing a long time to emotionally process what had happened to her. If she had still been able to, she would have been sick and cried endlessly, wailing on the floor. Instead, when she tried to make any noise, a tiny croak was all that emanated from the back of her hoarse throat. But before she could find a way to leave her apartment, something else found their way in. From way down on the floor, the men in their white hazard suits looked colossal, impossibly tall. Kate tried her best to dodge between the thick soles of their heavy boots as they came crashing down towards her from above, each one having enough force behind it to crush her in an instant. She leaped out of the way of one descending boot, only to be caught mid-air in a glass container. As the lid screwed tightly shut, sealing her inside, Kate was lifted up and saw a patch of the hazmat uniforms of the men that had come to take her away. A black circle with 3 arrows pointing in towards its center and an outline surrounding it. The Foundation put her in a glass tank with 11 other frogs, each of them looking almost identical to Kate, all climbing over each other, fighting for their own space in the tiny enclosure. From the moment she arrived, Kate could see the same thing in their gaze as they could see in hers. Sadness, unmistakable even in those dark, beady little eyes. These were people, or at least they had been human beings at some point. But now anything on the outside that had made them unique, their individuality, had been taken away, and their minds had all been locked inside the same frog-shaped body as Kate now found herself in. Over the next few months, the Foundation had their scientists running a series of tests on the frogs, who were now all categorized under the collective designation of SCP-006-1. Even though she was unable to speak, Kate recognized their methodical scientific process, how they would test 1 or 2 of the frogs at a time, note the results, then change a variable and repeat the test to see if there were any changes. It was the same process she used to go through every time a new sample arrived at her lab. Watching the researchers reminded her of her old job, the life she'd worked so hard for, and was cruelly reminded that it was all gone now. Nobody would ever know where she went. She'd never be able to go out amongst nature in the way that she had always loved. Kate had long since figured out the root cause of her transformation. A while after she had started to feel sick, she'd wonder if that strange fungus had anything to do with it. Seeing all the Foundation scientists and guards in their hazmat gear, only handling the other frogs with thick rubber gloves, seemed to prove her theory right, and suggested that she and her fellow amphibians were still infectious. Still, she currently had no way of communicating with the Foundation personnel about what had caused her to change, although they seemed as if they already knew. Most of the tests involved the researchers putting Kate and the other frogs into mazes or making them solve puzzles or memorizing commands. Naturally, having once been human, they all picked it up quicker than the researchers expected. From their perspective, these frogs were displaying an extremely advanced form of intelligence. Gradually, the testing progressed, and the Foundation's researchers began attempting to teach the frog specimens to read and write, all skills that they had already possessed, even if some of them needed some time to learn how to hold a pen in their new sticky fingers. Kate herself was made to complete an IQ test, scoring 127 points. Now that she had a way to communicate with these scientists through writing notes, she and the other SCP-306-1s were asked their names. That was the moment the Foundation realized what they were. These weren't just frogs, but human beings who were now trapped in the bodies of frogs. Perhaps inspired by this human-to-frog transformation, or possibly as some cruel joke, one of the Foundation researchers, who went by the name Thompson, brought in a children's book and presented it to the collection of SCP-306-1 specimens. At first, Kate enjoyed the simplicity of the stories, and it seemed her fellow frogs did as well, but gradually they all grew depressed. Maybe one of the stories featuring a prince being turned from a frog back into human form while the 12 remaining specimens had yet to be presented with a magical cure for their condition. Or perhaps seeing something as simple as a children's book reminded some of the frogs of all they were still to do in their old lives, like starting families, and now they wouldn't get the chance. Kate and some of the other frogs began writing notes to Thompson and another of the researchers who had been feeding them, Phyllis. They did their best to be reasonable with the Foundation, but also communicate how desperately they wanted to be set free. "You have no right to keep us here," Kate wrote, under the towering stare of Phyllis and Thompson, feeling for the first time in a long while that she was actively doing something to make a difference in nature. "We need to be out in the world. We need to be free." If she had more space on the paper, she would have tried to note down suggestions of places the frogs could be introduced, where they wouldn't pose any risk of disrupting the local ecosystem. The swamps of Louisiana, where the SCP-006 fungus had been found, were one such idea that came to mind. But much to Dr. Kate Barker's disappointment, she and her fellow frogs would only cause the fungi's infectious properties to spread, meaning their pleas with the Foundation fell on deaf ears. There was no other choice, nothing else they could do. They needed to break out. As night fell, Kate organized the frogs, gradually writing out instructions for how they were going to escape, communicating with them the same way she had with the researchers. Only this time, the others listened. Even if they couldn't be human again, they didn't want to live the rest of their short lifespans being locked up and tested forever. Kate marked down the time that Thompson and Phyllis usually fed the frogs and drew up a detailed strategy. If she could hide for long enough under the others, it might make it seem like one of the specimens was missing. The next day, researcher Thompson and researcher Phyllis arrived to feed the SCP-306-1 specimens, accompanied by security guards as always. While her colleague went to collect the feed for her to administer, Phyllis did a count of the frogs. 11. She counted again, only to get the same result. There was one missing. As she leaned closer to the tank, Kate trusted her fellow amphibians above to follow the plan. In a flash, the mass of frogs had leaped from their containment and pinned Phyllis to the ground as one. The room erupted into chaos. People turned frogs, leaping in all directions as they scattered and made a mad dash for freedom. A gunshot rang out from one of the security guards trying to subdue the creatures, only for the stray shot to catch researcher Thompson in the neck, killing him. Leading the charge on her tiny rubbery legs, Kate jumped closer and closer to the exit. It was so close. If she could just get far enough away, she might finally be free to get back to nature.
The tiny carnivorous snowmen are relentless, sharp fangs dripping with blood as they crawl en masse towards the mobile task force, opening fire on them with their assault rifles. Who would have guessed that a mere hour or two earlier, a young boy was joyfully playing around in the snow here? How had things gone from frosty to freaky so fast? Let's rewind the clock. There was a chill in the air, that lingering, biting cold that would gnaw at your exposed skin if you dared to step outside in anything less than a thick, warm coat for protection. The ground was still coated in a heavy snowfall, a holdover from Christmas just past, weather that had refused to let up well into the early days of the new year. Everyone reaches an age where the cynicism of life, the weight of expectations that keep you anchored in the real world, they all coalesce to rob you of the childlike wonder of the snow. As you get older, the snow loses its novelty. It becomes a source of inconvenience, something that you need to shovel off the driveway to take your car out. Whereas, turn the clock back to youth, and it's like a tiny miracle. It coats your whole world in a clean blanket of freezing frost, turning the ordinary into a wonderland. Robert and Michaela Anderson were glad that their son Michael was still at an age where he could enjoy the snow. After all, Michaela getting to take her son out in his sled or seeing him hurling snowballs at Robert was able to provide them with a little bit of warmth during the freezing cold, snowier months in Missouri. Optimism was never enough to melt the snow, however, and maybe that's what drew in those creatures, the snowmen. It was early 2019, not even a full 2 weeks into the year. By now, Michael had gotten used to the fact that after Christmas and New Year's Day, a begrudging return to school would soon follow. As much as it clearly brought down his mood, nothing lifted his spirits like still getting to be out in the snow. And after a long day of helping his mom take down the tinsel and pack up the lights while his dad disposed of the tree, Michael was itching to go outside. "Please, Mom?" he begged as a box of decorations was placed back in the attic. His hands clasped together in a pleading gesture.
Please, 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 just 5 minutes. I won't go further than the front yard.
Michaela sighed, partly from exhaustion, but a smile crept onto her face. It was hard not to find her son's love for the snow endearing. All right, but only for 5 minutes, she insisted firmly. And I want to see gloves, hat, and a scarf, not just a coat, mister. With the speed and excitement that she and her husband had long since lost, she watched Michael race off to gather his warmest winter coat. Remember when we were like that? Robert heaved a sigh as he appeared from chopping up that dried-out, dehydrated remains of the Christmas tree. No, do you? Michaela replied with a light chuckle. Before long, Michael had donned his gloves and coat, almost a size too big. His scarf was almost wrapping up his entire head, save for the little bobble hat that poked out at the top. Robert opened up the front door, and his son stepped out into a world that had been whitewashed with clear, cold snow. Given that the Andersons lived on a small street in Grain Valley, there weren't many other people around, especially not with another flurry of snowfall moving closer in the clouds up above. But it wasn't the next snowfall that the residents of Grain Valley, Missouri should have been worrying about. It was the previous one, the one that had already fallen, and what was now hiding among the snow in the Anderson family's front yard. Having few other kids his own age to play with and not being allowed to venture too far from the front porch, Michael was content to spend his precious time outdoors making snow angels or practicing throwing snowballs. He had long been trying to get one to clear the roof of the small house he and his parents shared, leaving a few scattered patches of snow embedded on the roof shingles. A few meters from the front door stood a snowman. Granted, that was hardly a rare sight at this time of year, especially in the cold weather, but what was so unusual about it was that Michael hadn't remembered making a snowman recently. His parents hadn't let him out in the snow on his own since the start of the new year, given how badly the downfall and icy winds had been for the first week of January. Sure, somebody else could have made it, taking a pause as they passed by the Andersons' front yard, although not Michael nor either of his parents had spotted anyone doing that. The snowman itself was featureless, the white of its ice-cold body smeared with mud and dead leaves, debris that had been packed in with the snow used in its crude construction. It was featureless, too. Whoever had made it hadn't gone to the effort of giving it a face, nor draped an old scarf over it or given it a hat. It just stood there, but not like any other snowman. There was nothing welcoming about it. In fact, it was, fittingly, cold. Given how far away it stood, it was almost as if it was watching the house. Curiously, Michael began to approach the snowman. Being only 9 years old, his imagination was immediately running with the possibility that this snow and mulch construct could be alive, much akin to the likes of Frosty the Snowman. Little did young Michael Anderson know that he wasn't far away from the truth, although this particular snowman wasn't quite the happy, jolly soul from the much-covered holiday song. He hadn't got that much closer to the snowman when he heard something move nearer to where he stood. There was the rustle of leaves and the snapping of small twigs coming up from a bush next to him. Michael couldn't see what it was, but it was far too low to the ground and too close to the house for it to be a bird. Maybe a possum or raccoon had gotten trapped in the thin branches and was now scrambling to try and free itself. Diverting from approaching the snowman, he walked closer to the plant. As he did, the rustling got louder, more frantic, almost hungry. There wasn't just one creature lurking out of sight beneath the leaves, but lots of somethings. Robert and Michaela had been sitting indoors watching the TV when they heard a spine-chilling scream coming from outside. Instantly, they were both up on their feet, racing toward the front door. Robert threw it open, and Michael dashed inside in floods of fearful tears. "What happened, sweetie?" Michaela asked, concerned, brushing snowflakes from her son's coat. "Are you okay? Did you slip?" Through crying and sniffling, shaking uncontrollably with how afraid he was, Michael couldn't find the words to answer. Instead, he pointed through the still open door directly at the snowman, still standing at the edge of the front yard. "How long has that been there?" Robert wondered aloud, taking a single step outside. "Don't, Dad!" Michael screamed. But it was already too late. Something small and speedy had leaped out of the snow in the front yard and latched onto Robert's leg. He howled as he felt searing pain, bitten by rows of tiny pointed teeth, as sharp as needles and as bitterly cold as ice. Stumbling back, Robert Anderson fell over and landed on the floor in the front hallway, inadvertently carrying whatever had attacked him into his home. Both Michaela and Michael screamed in fear as the tiny creature clawed its way up Robert's leg, while he swatted at it frantically, trying to brush it away before it could get closer. With a blind swipe of his hand, he knocked the creature to the floor and clambered to his feet, arms outstretched, keeping his wife and son behind him, while staring in disbelief at what had bitten him. It was barely more than half a meter tall, a tiny, white snowman. Bulbous, bloodied eyes bulged from its head, much like those of an insect. Directly between the eyes was a hole, a mouth not unlike a lamprey, lined with rows of sharp teeth that all pointed inwards. It reared up and lunged toward the Anderson family in a display of aggression that caused all three of them to jump, warily backing away from the snow creature. It was then that Robert and Michaela noticed what had frightened their son so much. Out of the corner of their eye, they both simultaneously caught the sight of the open front door and the yard beyond. Wriggling through the snow, shifting as they moved, were even more of the creatures, slithering towards the house like piranhas catching the scent of blood in the water. And standing ominously just beyond the driveway was the snowman, as if it was the general commanding its troops to storm the house. The Andersons raced upstairs as the swarm of snow creatures came spilling into the house, crawling from the yard onto the floor and piling on top of each other, like ants to climb the stairs. Naturally, Michaela's first instinct, as well as protecting her son, was to call the police. While Robert held the door to the bedroom shut, Michaela held Michael close and pleaded with the local Green Valley Police Department to come and help them. Although they only seemed to take the call seriously when Michael started screaming again. One of the snow creatures had pushed its way under the door frame and was sneaking its way towards Robert to attack him, leaving a trail of water behind it. Stepping back and thinking fast, Robert grabbed a hairdryer and switched it on full blast. The sudden rush of electrically heated air caused the toothy snow creature to retreat into a corner. Refusing to let up, Robert got closer and kept the hairdryer trained on it, eventually causing the creature to melt until little more was left than a damp puddle. But the victory was momentary. There were still more of them crawling up the stairs after the Andersons. With their sharp teeth, they were gnawing at the wood of the bedroom door, trying to force their way inside. Fortunately for Robert, Michaela, and their son Michael, they wouldn't be able to recall the horrific events of January 12, 2019 for much longer. By the time the local police arrived, it had become clear to the officers responding that they were well out of their depth, especially when one of them was injured, suffering a bite from a snow creature. That was what led the SCP Foundation being called in, and within 15 minutes, they had dispatched mobile task force operatives to secure the anomaly. Being some of the Foundation's most highly trained agents, it didn't take long for the MTF to neutralize the carnivorous snow creatures. However, they quickly realized that the mysterious snowmen that had seemingly spawned the swarm could not be melted by any conventional means, nor would it deteriorate naturally on its own. A cover story was issued that Michael had suffered an accident and fallen down an open pothole that had become obscured by heavy snowfall. As a result, police officers were dispatched to help him, although the injury sustained by one officer due to a bite from a snow creature was never explained. Following this, the Anderson family was administered amnestics, meaning they quickly forgot about the whole terrifying ordeal. Maybe it was for the best, however. Young Michael seemed irreparably changed. He never went out to enjoy the snow again, repeatedly suffering from nightmares about the cold. Meanwhile, the anomalous snowman was recovered and thus designated as SCP-4230. Immediately, the SCP Foundation did as their organization does best and commenced testing, with a human subject, no less. They quickly discovered that SCP-4230 seemed to generate a sort of field around itself that could trigger a distinctive physiological change in any human being or animal that came within 6 meters of the snowman. This process became known under the designation of SCP-4230-1. It appeared that Michael Anderson had managed to unknowingly escape this fate purely by not getting too close to SCP-4230, staying just far enough away so as not to trigger SCP-4230-1. The Foundation placed D-19375, a member of their D-Class personnel, within this 6-meter radius of the snowman, and observed the gradual changes he underwent over the following week. For simplicity's sake, we'll refer to D-19375 as Frost, a rather fitting moniker, and you'll soon see why. Within a day of exposure to the snowman, Frost complained to a senior researcher that he felt a lot colder than usual, although he exhibited no other observable symptoms beyond the coughing and sniffling of a common cold. By the following day, Frost was far worse for wear, appearing to have lost significant body mass to the point where he'd appeared to have been malnourished. His cold-like symptoms had continued, accompanied by disorienting dizziness, and as if all that wasn't bad enough, his skin tone had seemingly lost its natural pigment, reduced to an unnaturally pale shade, as white as snow. Day 3 saw Frost's body continue to change rapidly at an alarming rate. He was internally producing an unknown chemical that looked to be responsible for enacting certain alterations, namely the dissolving of his femur and fibula. The cold and dizziness were also now made all the worse by the addition of pain to the man's lower body. Frost even reported to Foundation researchers studying him that every movement he was able to make caused him to suffer extreme levels of physical pain. But yet, rather than attempt to cure his condition, the Foundation apathetically observed, noting down the process of SCP-4230-1. Within 5 days of exposure to SCP-4230, naturally occurring substances within Frost's body had traveled downwards and solidified. This was followed by the most shocking stage of the SCP-4230-1 process so far, and one that made the Foundation realize that these weren't just changes, it was a transformation. When Day 5 saw Frost's skeleton physically reshaping itself, his head becoming a sphere and his arms extending outwards like brittle twigs, it soon became clear what was happening to him. He was turning into a snowman. Rendered immobile and blind, a week after SCP-4230-1 began to take effect, Frost had started to secrete an unknown substance. This liquid lowered his body temperature, freezing almost instantly, and turning his skin into an icy white mass, worryingly similar to snow. Sure enough, on the 8th day, the extent of the SCP-4230-1 process was made evident. Frost had already perished, his body now looking identical to a plain, featureless snowman. No eyes or face, just a blank, cold slate. But underneath the outer layer of snow, Frost's bones and the rest of his organs were still contained inside. From the outside, though, he wasn't even human anymore. Just an instance of what became known as SCP-4230-A. However, being turned into another snowman by close proximity to SCP-4230 wasn't even the worst part. By now, you might be wondering, what were those snow creatures that attacked the Andersons? You'd be forgiven for thinking that perhaps these were rodents or other wild animals affected by SCP-4230-1. After all, testing has shown that the process doesn't just alter human physiology, but these carnivorous needle-toothed creatures are known as SCP-4230-Bs. And they are nasty little critters, to say the least. When a person or animal is turned into a snowman during SCP-4230-1, becoming one of these instances is far from the full extent of the transformation. The tests the Foundation conducted on Frost, and presumably on numerous other D-Class personnel as well, led to them discovering the further alterations made when someone becomes an SCP-4230-A instance. Their freezing, snow-encased bodies become hosts for white, spherical eggs. After a subject like Frost becomes an SCP-4230-A snowman, these eggs will hatch within 72 hours, producing up to 19 instances of SCP-4230-B creatures. The Foundation was quick to examine these bizarre snow spawn, gathering up as many as they could for testing. They found that instances of SCP-4230-B matured to adulthood remarkably quickly, reaching adulthood in 15 seconds. Destroying the eggs containing these creatures seemed to be an effective way of preventing swarms of SCP-4230-Bs from getting loose, although the snowman each egg came from would also have to be destroyed to achieve this result. Also, the lifespans of the smaller snow creatures only lasted for a total of 24 hours, and they would melt away after a full day of life, regardless of the surrounding temperature. SCP-4230-Bs seem uninterested in food that was presented to them. Specifically, one test involved giving a snow creature a head of lettuce and a watermelon. The creature regarded the fruit and vegetables with little interest, even refusing to eat either despite prompts from the researchers. This painted the SCP-4230-Bs as exclusive carnivores, which explained why they attacked the Anderson family. They were trying to eat them, hunting the Andersons as a pack. Further testing into SCP-4230-Bs revealed they had a weakness to heat above a temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. During another test, a D-Class was sent into a cell with 10 of the carnivorous snow creatures, armed only with a simple lighter, an emergency flare, and 1 gallon of gasoline. Immediately, all 10 of the SCP-4230-Bs crawled toward the man, hungry, and determined him to be a new source of food. That is, until they noticed the lighter he was carrying. The D-Class frantically clicked the spark wheel until the flame danced from the lighter, causing 7 of the creatures to back away from the heat source cautiously. The D-Class was able to kill the remaining 3 instances in self-defense, causing them to melt with little effort. He was far luckier than the subject of the next test would be. Another D-Class was placed in a holding cell with 3 of the snow creatures, and much like before, they instantly acknowledged his presence and began approaching him. However, the Foundation had sent this member of D-Class in completely unarmed, without even so much as a match to defend himself. The carnivorous beasts made short work of their helpless victim, feeding on what was left. The Foundation was able to dispatch instances of SCP-4230-B with relative ease, even without waiting for them to simply melt after a day. The use of flamethrowers or drawing them into warmer areas seemed effective enough at destroying the small snowman that hatched out of SCP-4230-A bodies. However, some bright spark at the Foundation decided to test what would happen if the opposite element was used against SCP-4230-B creatures. Were they vulnerable to the snow despite being made from a snow-like substance themselves? Another test was conducted to answer this, which involved a small snowball being thrown at one of the SCP-4230-Bs. The result of that incident has been entirely expunged from the Foundation's archives, but it's a safe guess to ask why. Evidently, when attacked using snow or ice, SCP-4230-Bs are seemingly able to adapt in some way that is determined to their attacker. Do they add snow to their mass or become even more aggressive? It's hard to say given the redactions, but the result of that final test were deemed so catastrophic that the Foundation banned any further testing that involved SCP-4230-Bs. As for where SCP-4230 first came from, the Foundation is still baffled. The first reported incident involving the killer snowman and the carnivorous creatures it produced came when the Andersons found themselves under siege by hungry SCP-4230-Bs. Maybe the snowman is just a freak of nature, or the result of an unknown pathogen or microorganism carried in a snowstorm one fateful night. Or perhaps SCP-4230 is something far, far more vicious. Whatever the case, we would recommend waiting for the sun to come back out and the snow to melt, just to be safe. The creature let out an unmistakable squeal of rage as stimulus Y-835 took effect. Dr. Christensen pressed his face up against the glass, eager to see the results. It had to work this time. It simply had to. He was certain that this attempt would make all the other failures worth it, and he'd once again prove the Foundation's faith in him to be well placed. SCP-5683 shrieked a loud, insect-like sound that would have normally made the blood run cold of anyone that heard it. But to Dr. Christensen, it was like music, a monster's dying fanfare to mark his success. Soon he'd be the researcher who neutralized not one, but 2 tenacious, highly adaptable anomalies. The senior researcher could feel his heart racing as the deadly giant spider started to twitch, then burst into 2 identical entities. The pair of arachnid anomalies had reacted much like the results of the tissue sample tests conducted earlier, dividing into 2 separate organisms. Christensen held his breath. The tissue samples had destroyed each other, attacking and injecting the other with lethal doses of venom. Surely, he reasoned, duplicating SCP-5683 into 2 would have the same result. His heart sank as he watched one of the spider creatures, the duplicate, perish almost immediately. As it often did when presented with human prey, SCP-5683 attacked using its mandibles and impaled its copy with its front legs to pin it in place. The clone had bitten back, with Dr. Christensen already knowing that would have granted SCP-5683 an immunity to its own venom. Its powers of adaptation were fiercely, frustratingly efficient, and nothing demonstrated this more than the intense reaction from the man tasked with destroying it. Dr. Christensen hurled the nearest object, a coffee mug, at a glass window of the observation room, overlooking the test chamber. He pounded his fist against the glass, hardly with the required force to cause damage, but enough to send pain shooting down Christensen's wrist, which then nestled in his forearm, a reminder that the experiment, like the others, had failed.
"Why can't I destroy you?"
he muttered through clenched teeth. looking with hatred at the enormous spider in the chamber below. The directive had reached him the day immediately after New Year's Day 2020, and straight from a member of the O5 Council no less. Their message expressed how impressed the Council was with Dr. Christensen's success with the Doomsday Clock project, and how favorably his name had been mentioned in Council meetings. This boded well for the ambitious Foundation doctor. He'd been hoping to snag the director position at Site-04 now that Director Bray had retired. But there was one more test from the O5 Council. They wanted Dr. Christensen to use the knowledge garnered during his previous success to solve the SCP-5683 problem. If he could successfully complete that assignment, it would be his ticket to being promoted. With the comfy role of site director and all its perks in mind, Dr. Christensen accepted the assignment from the Council to deal with SCP-5683. SCP-5683 was quite the beast, not an anomaly for those with intense arachnophobia. The huge spider-like organism was extremely hostile towards humans and had to be kept in a constant state of medical sedation. Otherwise, it would relentlessly attempt to breach containment and slaughter any and all personnel in its path. What had made SCP-5683 such a problem for the Foundation was the creature's ability to rapidly regenerate damage, as well as modify its own body in reaction to threats. Much like a certain particularly hard-to-destroy reptile, the spider-like entity could adapt itself to become more resistant to any danger posed to it. And of course, this meant that the Foundation needed this dangerous creature eradicated. The frequent containment breaches and sheer number of casualties caused by the arachnid anomaly were significant enough to cause an increasing drain on the SCP Foundation's resources. So, with the termination order coming from the very top, the O5 Council themselves, Dr. Christensen was tasked with overseeing the neutralization of SCP-5683. During an initial deliberation, Dr. Christensen met with researcher Miles and Hall, junior researcher Silva, and security chief Ade to discuss earlier attempts to terminate SCP-5683. The new head of the termination project was perturbed to learn that the research team had little in the way of useful information to offer, beyond what the Foundation already knew about the creature. But Christensen decided some basic stress testing would at least be a start. After a successful tissue sample test, wherein some of SCP-5683's genetic material was incinerated, Dr. Christensen tried to simply destroy the spider with fire. An understandable response, to say the least. However, exposing SCP-5683 to temperatures of 850 degrees Celsius for just 30 seconds didn't quite yield the easy victory he had hoped for. The arachnid thrashed about and screeched in reaction to the heat, only to rapidly develop a form of armor plating covering its entire body. The armor was comprised of an unknown, unidentifiable substance, but it was enough to prevent SCP-5683 from combusting. Reconvening with the rest of the team, Dr. Christensen hid his pride, assuring everyone he was just trying to establish a baseline during the previous test. Of course, he hadn't believed that terminating SCP-5683 with fire would be a success, or so he claimed, hiding how much he'd longed for an easy solution so he could snatch up the vacant Site-04 director position. But to ensure the others, Christensen explained that he'd requisitioned some anomalous materials from the O5 Council that they'd be using in their next termination attempts. Nothing that was anomalous enough to require containment, but toxic enough that they presented a few options for destroying SCP-5683. Just for logging purposes, sir, may I inquire about the specific substances we're shipping in? Junior researcher Sylvia had asked. Of course, Y220, Y835, and Y43. Dr. Christensen quickly recounted them all from memory. I'm told they should be arriving within the week. I expect each would be enough to do the job, but it's best to hedge our bets. This spider doesn't compare to the lizard, I'll tell you that. Junior researcher Silva seemed to take an interest in what Dr. Christensen had just alluded to, his previous work with the lizard. He probed further about it, and Christensen gave a solemn response. The aspiring Foundation doctor recalled an incident from a few years earlier during his experimentation with SCP-682. Some of the methods Dr. Christensen had opted to employ in an attempt to destroy the hard-to-destroy reptile had led to a severe containment breach.
When describing it, he used the word unpleasant, perhaps out of guilt at how many personnel had lost their lives due to his actions. Brushing the topic aside, he assured the team to get on with testing the new anomalous stimuli on SCP-5683. Stimulus Y220 initially showed some promise. During a tissue sample test, it successfully converted part of SCP-5683 into glass, which then violently exploded, leaving nothing behind. But attempts to use it to neutralize the creature itself quickly quashed those promising results. Within 9 seconds of being exposed to Stimulus Y220, SCP-5683's body rapidly turned to glass. Around 80% of its arachnid mass proceeded to explode, shattering in all directions, sending clear shards showering over the testing chamber. As he watched, Dr. Christensen allowed himself to believe that this was mission accomplished, that he'd successfully terminated SCP-5683. But his celebration was premature. The spider quickly began reconstituting itself, its body regenerating within the space of 30 seconds. After testing with both stimuli Y220 and Y835, Dr. Christensen's frustration seemed to be increasing with each failed attempt. He knew his promotion was within reach, and as far as he could remember, he'd done good work with damaging SCP-682. Why should eradicating this anomalous spider be any different? However, it was a test with stimulus Y436 that enraged the ambitious doctor. Expecting the anomalous stimulant to turn SCP-5683 into a fine mist, Christensen watched as the creature's body vanished, literally vaporizing, changing states of matter to little more than water in the air. Suddenly, every light in the facility powered off, plunging the testing chamber into darkness. When the lights came back on, SCP-5683 was standing on all 8 legs, right where it had been missed only 3 seconds earlier. The research team had gathered for another mediation, and Dr. Christensen's anger still hadn't subsided. He kicked a chair to emphasize his frustration, alarming junior researcher Silva, who urged him to calm down. After eventually cooling his temper, Christensen made an announcement that caused even greater concern to spread amongst the team. I'm requisitioning Y910. Researcher Halls and Researcher Miles objected, trying to get Dr. Christensen to realize that the course of this action was excessive, overkill even. But Christensen disregarded them, standing by his latest method for terminating SCP-5683. The Global Occult Coalition had previously used Y910 to poison gods. He felt sure that it would work on one anomalous giant spider. His time was running short. Dr. Christensen was aware that any day now, the O5 Council would be appointing a replacement director of Site-04, and he wanted that promotion. And he didn't seem to care what corners he cut and what risks he took to get there, even if it meant endangering his research personnel. Dr. Christensen declared that in order to save time, he would be bypassing tissue samples to test for termination attempts. The longer it took to terminate the anomalous arachnid, the more his window of opportunity closed, and the further the director position slipped from his fingertips. Accepting full responsibility for the reckless decision and anything that might go wrong, Dr. Christensen wanted to use stimulus Y910 directly on SCP-5683. He urged the research team to make the necessary preparations, unaware of what his decision would lead to, and the chaos it had already caused. The test was catastrophic, so much so that it caused a containment breach. With SCP-5683 loose and scuttling about the facility on its multiple legs, Dr. Christensen and junior researcher Silva were forced to rush to the secure bunker on site for safety. Christensen was in a state of panic until he noticed something, and not for the first time either. He'd been detecting a foul smell whenever he'd conducted the meetings to discuss termination options. But the other members of the research team had quickly explained it was nothing more than repeated accidents in the cafeteria. But here was the stench again, worse than ever. Yet junior researcher Silva brushed it off again, stating that SCP-5683 must have gotten into the facility's reactor. The junior researcher quickly became inconsolable, stating that the whole situation was his fault. Dr. Christensen interjected, demanding to know how it was and what Silva had done to cause this situation. He replied that it was his duty to oppose ill-advised actions,
And when Christensen had declared his intention to use Y910, the junior researcher hadn't opposed him. Shifting the blame from himself onto his subordinate, Dr. Christensen chastised Silva over how many personnel had died because of the junior researcher's refusal to do his job, ignoring that it was Christensen's own ambitions that had led to the current chaos. Refusing to be made a scapegoat, Dr. Christensen vowed to pin the full culpability for SCP-5683's containment breach onto junior researcher Silva, saying he'd tell the O5 Council the so-called truth about what had happened. But Silva pointed out that there wasn't much of a likelihood that the bunker would survive the reactor overloading. He urged the ambitious Foundation doctor to admit some responsibility of his own for what had happened, but Christensen refused. Suddenly, there came a thunderous banging at the bunker door. A debilitating pang of fear struck Dr. Christensen, causing him to scream and retreat from the entrance, yelling "No" and "Please," as if he was pleading with the universe itself to spare him from the spider. Junior researcher Silva walked over to the bunker door just as strong arachnid legs tore the heavy steel bulkhead off its hinges like it was made of little more than wet paper. There was SCP-5683, the enormous spider skittering into the bunker, screeching all the while. Silva had put himself between SCP-5683 and the ambitious Foundation doctor, whose hunger for a promotion had led to all this carnage. The junior researcher announced his noble intention to sacrifice himself, occupying the creature while urging Christensen to run. The doctor shoved Silva towards the spider and prepared to run, then all of a sudden, SCP-5683 vanished. Junior researcher Silva told Dr. Christensen he was disappointed, before researcher Miles, researcher Hall, and security chief Ade all entered the bunker through the torn open hole where the door had been. Christensen questioned where SCP-5683 had gone, to which Silva explained there was little reason to keep a dummy around once it had served its purpose as a substitute. "You mentioned you worked with the lizards, sir," the junior researcher recounted, "that there was a containment breach. If you don't terribly mind me asking, how did you escape that situation? It seemed quite lethal, didn't it?" Afraid and confused, Dr. Christensen asked where he was. Hall and Miles urged him not to ask questions he already knew the answer to. Silva explained who they all were, a jury, specifically Dr. Christensen's jury, and according to them, the ambitious doctor had disgraced himself again. Christensen had been there for a long time, a considerably long time, reliving the same events over and over again, with SCP-5683 acting as a substitute for SCP-682. It was the same situation, he'd made the same decisions, the same mistakes, and it had cost lives. Now Dr. Christensen was trapped in an endless loop, penance for the casualties that had occurred at his hands, all in the pursuit of his own selfish personal gain. He asked the jury how long he'd be stuck there, a question Silva responded to with, "Until you take responsibility, sir." Immediately, Dr. Christensen tried to admit that this all had been his fault, but he didn't mean it. Not really. He hadn't accepted blame. He just wanted a quick and easy way out of the loop, and the jury of his deceased personnel knew it. Christensen ran for the door in the hopes of escaping his fate. Futile as his chances were, a black iron chain appeared from around the corner and wrapped itself around the overambitious doctor's throat, ignorant of his pleas for forgiveness, saying he was sorry wouldn't bring back the people who died in service of his aspirations to becoming a site director. The chain dragged Dr. Christensen through the facility at such a speed that he collided with every wall and every corner as he turned sharply, being pulled along the floor. But that and the walls quickly crumbled away, revealing a sight that made Dr. Christensen start screaming that it wasn't his fault, and he never really stopped. What followed involved a great deal of blood and fire. Once it was over, it left behind the same awful stench the doctor had smelt before, and he'd soon be smelling it again too, as the cycle repeated itself. The directive had come straight from a member of the O5 Council. They were impressed with Dr. Christensen, and the ambitious Foundation doctor had been hoping to snag a director position at Site-04. But there was one final test for Dr. Christensen to solve the SCP-5683 problem.
Now check out SCP-5000Y, the full story compilation, and SCP-3023, and then it decided to be an angry spider for more.